Hi there and welcome back to another quiet night together. If this happens to be your first time here, I am really glad you found your way to me. Get comfortable because tonight's story is going to change the way you picture where you come from, even if you have never set foot on this island in your entire life. Picture this for a moment. A quiet cave somewhere in the west of England. Inside it, scientists once uncovered a face frozen in time. Skin as dark as rich wet soil and eyes the colour of a pale winter sky. For over a century, almost nobody believed that combination was even possible. And yet this face may be the closest thing we have to a true portrait of the very first people who ever called this island home. Before we step into their world together, I want to ask you for something small. If quiet stories like this one keep you company at night, it would mean more than you know if you tapped that subscribe button, left a little like on your way out, or dropped a comment down below before you drift off. I look through every single one, I promise you that. So tell me, where are you tonight? Tucked into bed, driving home through the dark, or maybe already halfway to sleep? I would love to know. Now go ahead and turn the lights down low if you can. Maybe let a fan hum softly somewhere in the room. Get yourself completely comfortable. Tonight we're travelling back further than you might expect, all the way to the silence before Britain was Britain, long before there was a word for this place, before anyone had ever called it Britain or England or home. There was only ice. For thousands of years the northern half of this world lay buried under sheets of frozen white, thick enough to bury forests, rivers and entire mountain ranges, without a single sound to mark the years passing. No footsteps, no fire, no voices, just cold air drifting over nothing and nothing moving back. In some places that ice reached higher than any building most of us will ever stand inside. Layer pressed on top of layer, winter after winter, until the sheer weight of it was enough to slowly bend the shape of the land underneath. Woolly mammoths, once common across this same ground, were already becoming rare, slipping away into memory along with the ice itself. Somewhere far south of that frozen line, small groups of humans were still surviving, waiting the way families wait out a long, hard winter that never seems to end. They had no idea an entire island was sleeping under ice, just beyond the horizon, patiently waiting for its turn to be born. And then slowly, almost too slowly to notice at first, the world began to change. The ice loosened its grip. Rivers that had been silent for centuries began to whisper again, carrying meltwater across a landscape no living eye had seen in this shape before. Around 11,700 years ago, something shifted. A warming that scientists still study today in ice cores pulled from deep beneath Greenland layer by layer, almost like the rings of a very old, very cold tree, each one holding a faithful record of the exact moment the climate finally turned. And inside that warming, an entire new world quietly opened up. Here is something that might surprise you. Britain the way you probably picture it today, an island cut off proudly separate from the rest of Europe, guarding its own coastline like a moat around a castle, was not an island at all. Not yet. For thousands of years after the ice began to melt, this land was still joined to the continent by a wide stretch of low green ground that modern researchers now call Doggerland. Rivers ran through it wide and slow and silver in the early light. Marshes sat thick with reeds and birdsong. Somewhere in its forests wolves called to each other across the dark. Herds of deer and wild cattle moved freely through it, following the seasons with no border, no channel, and no idea that one day all of it would vanish beneath the sea. We will come back to that particular story because what eventually happened to Doggerland is one of the most devastating events in ancient history. But not tonight. Tonight belongs to the people who walked across it while it was still whole. Somewhere in that new thawing world, small groups of people began to move. They were not explorers, not in the way we usually picture that word, with a flag planted proudly in the ground. There were no maps unrolled beside a fire, no grand plan, no name yet for the place they were slowly walking toward. They were simply following whatever kept them alive. Herds of red deer, rivers full of fish, the the steady promise of forest thick enough to shelter a family through a long uncertain season. Nobody among them was worrying about a mortgage or a work deadline or a phone battery running low. Just fire food and finding somewhere safe enough to finally close their eyes. Maybe you have felt a small piece of that yourself if you have ever moved somewhere completely new. A different city, a different country even. Somewhere unfamiliar where nothing yet has a story attached to it. That small nervous feeling of not knowing a place yet but needing it to work anyway. Now multiply that feeling by 10,000 years spread across generations who had no idea what, if anything, waited for them at the end of the walk, and you start to get close to what this journey must have actually felt like. If it helps, here is something worth holding on to. At almost exactly this same moment in history on the completely other side of the world, another group of humans was making a strangely similar journey. They were crossing a different land bridge, one connecting Siberia to Alaska, walking into a continent that had never once felt a human footstep before either. We know them today as the very first Americans. Two groups oceans apart, neither one aware the other existed, both stepping into brand new worlds at almost the same moment in time. I find something oddly comforting in that. As if right at the start, the whole human story decided to begin the exact same way twice, in two places without either side knowing. It is worth sitting with that for a second. Almost every country on Earth, if you follow its story back far enough, begins with somebody arriving from somewhere else. Not conquering, not claiming, just arriving tired and hopeful, and quietly deciding to stay. Britain's story and America's story in this one particular way are not so different after all. They both start with footsteps that had no idea what they were walking toward. Step by step, generation by generation, the small bands moving toward Britain went north and west, deeper into a landscape that had been empty of human voices for longer than anyone alive could possibly imagine. And at some point, nobody knows the exact day, and honestly there is a strange kind of comfort in that too. At some point, a set of footprints pressed into soft ground somewhere in what is now Britain, and simply stayed there long enough to matter. Try to imagine it for a moment. No cities, no roads, no borders drawn on paper by people who would not exist for thousands of years yet. Just tall trees leaning into a pale sky, rivers cutting narrow paths through unclaimed ground, wild cattle moving in the distance like slow grey clouds, and a small group of people tired alert, carrying almost everything they owned on their backs, stepping into a land that did not have a name. Picture a mother lifting a child over a fallen log, an older man pausing to test the depth of a river with a long wooden stick before anyone else steps in. Someone else almost certainly muttering under their breath about the weather. I like to believe that part at least. Some things apparently never really change, no matter how many thousands of years pass in between. And somewhere ahead of them, rising slowly out of the ground like something from another world, pale cliffs of chalk began to appear on the horizon. The very same cliffs that still stand today, the ones so many travellers now recognise as the first proud glimpse of England from the sea. To this small band of walkers, those cliffs were not a symbol of anything yet. They were just stone and light, and one more stretch of unfamiliar ground to cross before nightfall. They did not know they were making history. They were only trying to survive until morning, and honestly, that is the part of this story that never stops moving me. Every single person alive today, whether you were born in a small town in Ohio, or in London or somewhere, nobody outside your own family has ever heard of, is connected through thousands of unseen generations to someone who once stood exactly like that. Cold, uncertain, quietly brave without ever once thinking of themselves that way. Now here is where the story takes a turn that seems to surprise almost everyone who hears it for the first time. If I asked you to close your eyes right now and picture the very first people who ever called this island home, what would you actually see? Maybe pale skin, light hair, Someone who looks like they stepped straight out of an old black and white photograph politely apologizing for the weather while holding a cup of tea. I have to be honest with you. That picture is almost completely wrong. The earliest people of Britain, the ones who walked here in those first difficult centuries after the ice pulled back, most likely had skin far darker than almost anyone today would expect, alongside eyes so pale and so blue they would not look out of place in a film set somewhere in modern Scandinavia. Dark skin, light eyes. A combination most of us have been taught without ever being told so directly simply does not belong together, and yet it did. Scientists have now found this same striking combination not only here, but scattered across ancient remains all the way from Spain to Hungary. For thousands of years across an entire continent, it was not some rare exception. It was simply normal. Years ago, working from evidence pulled out of that quiet cave I mentioned earlier, a team of researchers eventually built a full lifelike model of this person's face. Skin, eyes, hair, expression, all of it grounded in what the evidence actually showed, rather than what anyone assumed it should show. And when that face was finally revealed to the public, it did something strangely remarkable. It made an entire country pause and ask itself an honest question. What does it actually mean to look like you belong somewhere? We're going to spend this entire journey slowly unpacking exactly how we know that. How a tiny fragment of bone resting undisturbed inside a quiet cave for thousands of years was eventually able to describe a human face in more detail than any historian working from old texts ever could. But before we get to that part, before the laboratories and the careful hands and the slow, patient science of people who spend their whole careers listening to the past, I think it matters that we sit here a little longer inside the silence of that very first arrival, because somewhere in that silence footsteps pressed into soft ground for the very first time, shivering slightly in the cool morning air. Cautious, alone in a landscape without a name, not knowing they were the beginning of everything that would one day be called Britain, not knowing that thousands of years later someone like you would still be thinking about them late at night wrapped in a warm blanket, wondering who they really were. It is a strange kind of gift if you think about it. A face that old, still able to surprise us, still able to gently remind an entire island and honestly an entire audience watching from thousands of miles away tonight that the story of who we are has never once stood still. To understand how that face survived at all hidden and silent for so many thousands of years, we have to go back even further still. Back before footprints, back before rivers ran again through Doggerland. Back to the ice itself, and the long frozen silence that came before a single human step in this land was even possible. Let's stay there for a moment in that frozen silence because it lasted far longer than most people realize. We're not talking about a rough winter or even a rough decade. We're talking about an age. For somewhere close to 60,000 years on and off, this land drifted in and out of deep cold, and for the very worst stretch of it, roughly between 22,000 and 13,000 years ago, Britain was not simply cold. It was empty, completely empty of people. Ice sat thick across most of the north. The ground further south froze solid year-round, and anyone who might have once called this place home had already been pushed out generations before, back across the very land that connected Britain to the rest of Europe. Picture the ground itself, if you can, not as green fields or rolling hills, but as something closer to the surface of another planet. Frozen soil that never fully thawed even in the brightest part of summer. Low tough grasses bending under gusts of cold air that almost never stopped. Herds of reindeer and wild horse moving across it in search of anything worth eating animals built for exactly this kind of world, in a way that we frankly are not. This was not a paused version of the Britain we know today. It was in almost every practical sense a different world entirely, one that simply happened to sit on the same patch of earth. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second. Where do you go when the whole world you know simply becomes unlivable? For the people of that time, the answer was south, deep into what is now Spain and southern France. Scientists call these places refugia, which is really just a gentle word for shelter, for the pockets of land warm enough and green enough to keep a small population alive while everything else outside froze over. For thousands of years, entire family lines survived only because their ancestors happened to walk far enough south, early enough to reach one of these quiet corners of the map. Britain during all of this was not a homeland to return to. It was barely even a memory. It was a rumour of a place told and retold by people who had never seen it themselves, passed down the way a family might talk about a house nobody living has ever actually walked through. And here is something worth pausing on because it puts these refugee zones in a completely different light. While Britain sat frozen and empty, some of these same southern shelters, particularly across what is now northern Spain and southwestern France, were producing something extraordinary. Deep inside limestone caves sealed away from the cold and the weather outside, people of this era were painting. Not crude scratches, but detailed deliberate images of bison, horses and deer, rendered with a level of skill that still leaves modern art historians a little stunned. Some of these paintings have survived essentially untouched for over 15,000 years. It is worth remembering that while one part of this story is about survival in its rawest form, cold hunger movement, another part of it playing out at almost the exact same time, only a country or two away, was about something closer to beauty. Both of those things were happening under the same sky. And then around 15,000 years ago, something changed. The climate shifted into a brief welcome warm spell, and cautiously, carefully, people began moving north again. Reindeer herds pushed forward into freshly thawed ground, and small bands of hunters followed close behind them the way they always had. One of those bands found their way into a cave in Somerset in the southwest of England. The very same cave, in fact, where that face we talked about earlier would eventually be discovered thousands of years later. But this was not those people. Not yet. This was somebody else entirely, and their story deserves a moment of its own before we move on. For the short time they were there, this group lived quite well by the standards of their world. They hunted wild horse and reindeer along the gorge outside the cave, worked flint into fine, precise blades, and by all appearances kept dogs close by some of the earliest evidence of that particular partnership anywhere in Britain. It is easy to imagine that part honestly. A fire at the mouth of a limestone cave, the smell of roasting meat, a dog curled up somewhere near the warmth, children underfoot. For a brief, fragile moment, this must have felt like exactly what it was. A home. Researchers now believe this particular group lived in that cave for a remarkably short window of time, likely no more than 2 or 3 generations gathered there during hunting season before moving elsewhere. What they left behind, though, has kept scientists talking for decades. Alongside butchered animal bone and finely worked stone tools, archaeologists found human bone that had been deliberately carefully shaped. Skulls cleaned and trimmed with real precision appear to have been turned into drinking vessels. Not out of violence towards strangers, most researchers now believe, but as part of how this particular group chose to honour their own dead. A funeral rite, in other words, just one built around a set of customs almost nothing like our own. I want to be careful with how I say this next part because it is easy to let a detail like that overshadow everything else about these people. They were not monsters, and this was not some horror story playing out in a dark cave. It was more likely an act of grief, translated through a belief system we simply do not share and cannot fully reconstruct. Every culture in every era has its own way of trying to hold on to the people it loses. Some build monuments, some keep ashes in a jar on a shelf, some carry a photograph in a wallet for 40 years. Theirs happened to look nothing like ours, and it is worth resisting the urge to judge a ritual we will never fully understand by the standards of a world that came 14,000 years after it. Here is the part of the story that tends to catch people off guard, though. As suddenly as this group appears in the archaeological record, they disappear from it again, just as the world seemed to be settling into something warmer, something livable. The climate turned once more. This particular cold snap has a name today, borrowed from a small white flower that thrives in Arctic conditions. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas, and for roughly 1,200 years, starting around 12,900 years ago, Europe plunged back into conditions nearly as harsh as the depths of the Ice Age itself. Temperatures in some regions dropped by several degrees within a single human lifetime, in some places within a matter of decades, a shift fast enough that people could plausibly have noticed the world changing within their own memory. Forests that had only just begun to spread thinned out again. Rivers that had briefly run free slowed and stiffened. Herds scattered or vanished outright, taking with them the only reliable source of food this land had ever offered. And here is the detail that tends to surprise most people, myself included, the first time I came across it. Across the entire span of the Younger Dryas, more than 1,000 years of cold, there is no confirmed evidence anywhere in Britain of a single human being. Not one dated bone. Not one dated tool. As far as the archaeological record can tell us, the people who once shaped those skulls in that Somerset cave simply left or perished, and did not come back. Which raises an uncomfortable, quietly fascinating question, doesn't it? What happened to them, nobody knows for certain. But later genetic research would eventually reveal something that made the mystery even stranger. That first group in Guff's cave the skull cup makers were not. It turns out closely related to the people who would resettle Britain afterward. Their genetic line traced back to older hunter-gatherer populations connected to what is now northern Spain and Belgium populations that were already fading out across much of Europe by the time the Younger Dryas ended. In other words, this was not a pause in one continuous story. It was closer to two entirely different families arriving at the same address, thousands of years apart, one of them never getting the chance to stay. There is something quietly humbling about that if you let it sit with you for a moment. An entire group of people with their own habits, their own grief, their own way of shaping flint and burying the dead, simply stops appearing in the record and the land does not remember them for it. No monument marks where they lived. No name survives for what they called themselves. The only reason we know they existed at all is because a handful of bones happened to survive in exactly the right conditions, in exactly the right cave for exactly long enough for somebody 10,000 years later to notice. When the ice finally truly broke around 11,700 years ago, the people who walked back into Britain this time were carrying something different in their blood. To understand where they came from, we have to look south again, but this time to a much broader story unfolding across Italy and the Balkans, and out toward what is now the Near East. Around 14 to 15,000 years ago, during that same earlier warm spell that briefly let the skull cup makers reach Somerset, something else was happening on a much larger scale. A genetic shift swept across huge portions of Europe so thorough and so far-reaching that scientists can trace its fingerprints in ancient remains found from Sicily all the way up into Britain. It is named appropriately enough after a small cave in northern Italy called Villa Bruna, where one of the earliest and clearest examples of this new population was found. Here is what makes this discovery so remarkable to me. Researchers were able to identify this shift by comparing genetic material from dozens of individuals scattered across an entire continent, people who had never met, never known of each other's existence, separated by thousands of miles and in some cases thousands of years. and yet laid side by side in a laboratory their bones told the same story. A single expanding population quietly replacing the older groups around it, not through war or conquest that we can see any evidence of, but simply through the slow, patient arithmetic of survival generation folding into generation until one lineage simply outlasted the others. Nobody knows exactly why this particular group expanded so successfully, while older populations quietly faded. Perhaps they simply adapted better to a changing world. Perhaps it was as unremarkable as being in the right place at the right moment in history, generation after generation, until their descendants outnumbered everyone else. But by the time Britain was fully clear of ice for good, it was their children and their children's children who finally walked back in and stayed. This is the population Cheddar Man belonged to. This is where that dark skin and those pale, startling eyes actually came from a lineage stretching all the way back through Western Europe to a warm cave in the Italian mountains, carried forward across thousands of miles and thousands of years by people who had no idea their journey would ever be traced at all. It is strange to think that the very first true settlers of Britain, the ones we will spend the rest of this story following, were themselves the result of one population quietly winning out over another somewhere far away, long before a single one of them ever set eyes on this island. Belonging, it turns out, was already complicated before the story even properly began. Can I ask you something while we sit with that for a moment? Have you ever moved somewhere new and had the strange quiet feeling that you were not really starting something so much as finally arriving at something that had been waiting for you the whole time? Maybe a house or a city or even just a season of your own life. I would love to know if you feel like sharing it down in the comments before you drift off tonight. I think about that feeling often when I look into Britain's earliest history, because if there is one pattern that keeps repeating story after story, it is this. Britain is almost never where a journey begins. It is where a journey finally ends. Tucked away at the far northwestern corner of an entire continent cut off by water. More often than not, it has spent most of its history as a kind of last stop, a place people reached only after every closer option had already been tried or lost or frozen over. There is something almost architectural about it if you think about it that way. Every great migration across Europe, whether driven by ice or hunger or opportunity, eventually pushes outward toward its edges, and Britain sits right at one of those edges, quietly waiting generation after generation for whoever manages to go the farthest. If it helps to picture it, think about how the American West is often talked about, that romantic idea of the frontier, the far edge of a much bigger map settled last by whoever was willing to travel farthest and hold on the longest. Britain has played a strikingly similar role for the whole of European history, just facing the opposite direction. Not a frontier of open plains, but a frontier of open water. The very last stop before the map simply runs out. We will see that pattern again and again as this story continues. Farmers will make that same long journey one day. So will people carrying bronze and horses and entirely new gods. But that part of the story is still a long way off, for now the ice is finally gone. The land is green again, walked once more by careful, watchful footsteps, this time by people whose descendants would still be here in one form or another 10,000 years later. And somewhere ahead of us, in that very same cave where a group of strangers once shaped skulls into cups and then quietly vanished from history, another set of bones is waiting. Bones that would stay hidden, undisturbed, wrapped in cold stone and silence for thousands of years longer, until a group of workmen digging for something else entirely on an ordinary afternoon stumbled onto a discovery that would eventually change how an entire country understood itself. It happened on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon in the spring of 1903. A small crew of workmen were down in that same cave in Cheddar Gorge, not looking for anything historic at all. They were simply trying to improve the drainage part of an ongoing effort to make the cave safer and more comfortable for the paying visitors who'd already started coming to see it. This was after all a business. The gorge had become something of a local attraction by the turn of the century, and the man who ran the cave, a local resident named Richard Goff, had spent years widening passages and laying paths, hoping to turn a strange damp hole in the ground into something people would pay good money to walk through. Try to picture the scene honestly. Not a team of scientists in careful gloves brushing away soil one grain at a time. Just working men with shovels and lanterns, breath fogging in the cold underground air, doing a job that had absolutely nothing to do with history. Somewhere above them, Victorian tourists in heavy coats were probably queuing for tickets, completely unaware of what was about to be pulled out of the ground just a short walk beneath their feet. So there is a certain dry humour to how this story really begins. Nobody was hunting for the earliest Britain that day. They were hunting for better foot traffic. And then somewhere beneath the mud and loose stone they were clearing out a shovel struck something that was clearly not rock. What they eventually uncovered was a nearly complete human skeleton, lying undisturbed in a narrow recess of the cave precisely where it had been placed thousands of years earlier. To this day it remains the oldest, essentially complete human skeleton ever found anywhere in Great Britain, which, if you stop and think about it for a second, is a fairly remarkable thing for a drainage project to accidentally produce. Word of the discovery spread fast, and predictably so did the exaggeration. This was the early 1900s, remember, an era when the tools for accurately dating old bones simply did not exist yet. Scientists of the time had enthusiasm to spare, but they were working almost entirely on guesswork dressed up as expertise. Early estimates place the skeleton's age somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 years old, numbers that would have made him not just ancient, but almost unimaginably so older than most of the cave art we talked about earlier, older than nearly anything else known in Britain at the time. Newspapers loved it. There was real pride wrapped up in the idea that this quiet corner of Somerset might be home to the single oldest human being ever discovered on British soil. It helps, I think, to remember what kind of moment this was for British archaeology as a whole. Barely a decade later, a very different discovery would be presented to the world with the same breathless confidence a skull found near a village called Piltdown announced as proof of a missing evolutionary link between apes and humans. It took decades before anyone properly examined it and discovered the whole thing had been faked, pieced together from unrelated bones and quietly aged with chemicals. I'm not suggesting anything so dishonest happened here in Cheddar Gorge. This was an honest mistake, not a hoax. But it says something about the era. Confidence back then often walked several steps ahead of actual evidence, and an entire country was eager to believe in its own impossibly ancient roots. It would take more than half a century for anyone to actually prove the original estimate wrong. The tool that finally settled the argument, radiocarbon dating, was not even invented until the late 1940s, and it took a good while longer to be refined enough for a case this delicate. When researchers finally applied it properly to the skeleton in the 1970s, the results were not even close to those original headline-grabbing numbers. The real age came back at roughly 10,000 years old, give or take a little. Now, 10,000 years is still an extraordinary span of time, plenty enough to earn him a permanent place in the history books. But it was also quietly a demotion. He was not some impossibly ancient relic from the deepest reaches of the Ice Age after all. He belonged instead to a very specific and much more recent chapter, one we have already been discussing. He was one of the descendants of that population, who finally walked back into an ice-free Britain for good, the ones carrying that far-reaching lineage traced back to a warm cave in Italy. In other words, this was not some outlier. This was, in the most literal sense possible, one of the very first true settlers of this island. Can we talk about him for a moment not as a headline but as an actual person? Whoever he was, he did not live to see old age. The skeleton belonged to a young man likely somewhere in his early 20s when he died, standing around 5.5 feet tall, which was entirely typical for men of that period. Analysis of the chemical signatures locked inside his bones and teeth. The kind of quiet forensic work that can tell scientists what somebody actually ate over the final years of their life suggests a diet built around red meat from wild deer and cattle, freshwater fish pulled from nearby rivers, and whatever wild plants the season allowed. He had not gone hungry in any serious way. Whatever difficulties his world presented going without food does not appear to have been a defining one, at least not most of the time. But there is one more detail, and it is the part of his story that tends to stay with people the longest. Just above the right eye socket of his skull there is an injury, a crater-shaped mark distinct enough that it clearly was not a natural feature of the bone. For years, researchers have debated exactly what caused it. Some believe it points toward a serious bone infection, the kind that could have caused him real lasting pain in the final stretch of his short life. Others believe the shape and placement are more consistent with a blow, a genuine injury inflicted by something or someone striking him directly above the eye. This is honestly one of the quiet frustrations of working with bone this old. A skeleton can describe an injury in remarkable detail, its shape, its depth, roughly how long the person survived afterward, but it almost never explains the story behind it. It cannot tell you whether it was an accident on a hunt, a fall from a rocky ledge along the gorge, an illness that slowly ate away at the bone from the inside, or a fight with another person that ended badly. Forensic scientists studying far more recent remains run into this same wall constantly. Bone is honest, but it is rarely talkative. Nobody today can tell you with total certainty which explanation is correct, and honestly I think that uncertainty is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. It would be easy to turn this into a tidy little murder mystery for the sake of a good story, and I do not want to do that to him. What we can say is that his final years were not necessarily gentle ones, and that a young man barely into adulthood by our standards met an end that left a permanent mark on his skull one way or another, and yet somebody buried him carefully deep inside that cave in a way that suggests he mattered to the people around him. Not thrown into a ditch, not left where he fell, placed deliberately in a spot that would keep him undisturbed for 10,000 years until a group of men chasing better drainage stumbled straight into him. Whatever else was happening in his short life, he was not simply discarded when it ended, and there is something quietly comforting in that, even across such an enormous stretch of time. For decades after his discovery, that was more or less where his story stood. A skeleton, a wildly incorrect age eventually corrected, a single unresolved injury. And then in the mid-1990s, an Oxford geneticist named Brian Sykes decided to try something that at the time felt almost like science fiction. Sykes had built a career studying mitochondrial deoxyribonucleic acid, the small specific piece of genetic material passed down only from mother to child generation after generation, almost entirely unchanged across thousands of years. It is not the whole story of who a person is not even close, but it is remarkably good at tracing one very specific thread, all the way back through time, an unbroken line of mothers reaching into the deep past. He wanted to know whether any trace of this ancient man's maternal bloodline might still exist among the people currently living in the very same village. So he approached local residents of Cheddar, students and teachers among them, and asked for a simple cheek swab comparing a small specific piece of their genetic material against a sample carefully extracted from one of the skeleton's molars. Out of roughly 20 people tested, 3 came back as matches. 2 were students whose names were never made public. The third was a history teacher at the local school, a man named Adrian Target. Picture that moment for him, if you can. An ordinary school teacher living an ordinary life in a small English village, teaching history to teenagers who probably rolled their eyes through most of his lessons, who wakes up one day to find his own face on the front page of newspapers around the world, connected by an unbroken maternal line to a man who'd been dead for roughly 10,000 years. By his own account afterward, he had simply volunteered his cheek swab to show his students the process was painless, never once expecting to be the actual result. There is something wonderfully human about that. The teacher who agreed to go first purely to set an example and ended up becoming the story himself. 300 generations of mothers, one after another, stretching back to a young man in a cave and somehow remarkably still traceable, all the way to a man living less than a mile from where those bones had been resting the entire time. For a little while, the sleepy village of Cheddar found itself at the centre of a genuine media circus. Camera crews turned up outside the school gates. Journalists from as far away as the United States called Target at home, asking him only half joking what it felt like to have a 10,000-year-old relative. Tourism to the gorge reportedly picked up. Somewhere in all of it, a quiet Somerset school teacher briefly became one of the most talked about men in the country, purely for sharing a piece of genetic code with someone who'd been dead for longer than most of recorded history combined. It made for an irresistible headline, and I completely understand why. There is something deeply moving about that kind of continuity proof that a community can, in some fragile thread, thin way, persist across an almost unimaginable stretch of time. But here is the part of the story I find far more interesting than the discovery itself, and it connects directly to something we touched on earlier tonight. At the time, almost everyone who saw that story, myself included, if I am being completely honest, pictured something specific without even realizing they were doing it. A teacher, a modern Englishman, fair-skinned most likely, ordinary brown or blue eyes, the kind you would not look twice at on a street in Somerset. And without anyone ever saying so directly, that image quietly attached itself to the ancient man in the cave as well. Surely people assumed if they share the same bloodline they must have looked at least somewhat similar. That assumption, as later research would eventually prove, could hardly have been more wrong. And I think that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is a mistake nearly all of us make, myself absolutely included, without ever noticing we are making it. We assume shared ancestry means shared appearance. We assume the past deep down must have looked something like the present, just with worse plumbing and no electricity. Family trees get flattened in our imagination into a single unchanging face repeated backward through time like a photocopy. It rarely, if ever, actually works that way. Faces change, skin changes, eyes change. The only thing that truly carries forward generation after generation is the story itself, not the picture we happen to attach to it. Here is a question for you honestly. If a scientist showed up at your door and told you that you shared an unbroken bloodline with someone who lived 10,000 years ago, what would you picture them looking like? Take a second and actually imagine it. I would be curious to know if you feel like telling me down in the comments. Whatever you just imagined, I would be willing to bet it looked at least a little bit like you. For nearly a century, this man from Guff's Cave existed almost entirely as numbers and guesswork. A rough age later corrected, a rough height, an unresolved injury, a surprising headline making genetic thread connecting him to one particular teacher in one particular village. But nobody, not the workmen who found him, not the scientists who dated him, not even Sykes with his careful cheek swabs actually knew what he looked like. Not really. Not yet. Think about that for a second. A skeleton sitting behind glass studied by generation after generation of scientists, and for 115 years not one of them could have told you the colour of his eyes. That would take an entirely different kind of science, one built not on guesswork or bone measurements, or even a single strand of maternal deoxyribonucleic acid, but on reading nearly every letter of genetic code his body had left behind, more thoroughly and more precisely than anyone had ever managed to study an ancient human being before. It would take a tiny hole drilled into the hardest bone in his skull, a laboratory full of extraordinarily patient people, and a piece of technology that when this man's bones were first pulled out of that cave floor in 1903, nobody on Earth had even dreamed of yet. And that story, the story of how a few careful scientists eventually turned a drilled fragment of skull into something close to an actual photograph taken across a gap of 10,000 years, is where we need to go next. Here is something worth knowing before we go any further with this part of the story. For most of the last century, bone simply did not want to give up its secrets easily. If you've ever wondered why it took until 2018, more than 100 years after that skeleton was first pulled out of the ground, for anyone to actually determine what he looked like, the honest answer is that the science required to do it did not exist yet. Not even close. Genetic material, the delicate molecular thread that carries a person's biological blueprint, breaks down over time. Bacteria from the surrounding soil creep in and contaminate it. Centuries of dampness, temperature changes, and simple decay chew away at it piece by piece, until there is often nothing usable left at all. Think about it this way. A strand of genetic material is a little like an old cassette tape left in a damp basement for 10,000 years. Even if the tape survives at all, most of what plays back is noise, static, and silence, with only scattered fragments of the original recording still intact. For most of the 20th century, that was simply the reality researchers had to accept. For decades, most bones from this period of history were considered a dead end for this kind of work, no pun intended. Too degraded, too contaminated, too old. So how then did scientists eventually manage to pull a usable genetic blueprint out of a skull that had been sitting in a museum drawer for the better part of a century, already handled, measured and photographed by generation after generation of curious researchers? The answer turned out to be hiding in one of the densest, most overlooked bones in the entire human body. Tucked deep at the base of the skull, protecting the delicate structures of the inner ear, sits a small, remarkably hard piece of bone called the petrous bone. For most of the history of archaeology, almost nobody paid it any particular attention. It is not the bone that catches your eye in a museum case. It does not tell you much on its own about height or age or how somebody died. But researchers working across several different ancient burial sites in the early 2010s eventually discovered something that changed the entire field of ancient genetics almost overnight, not just for this one skeleton, but for practically every ancient burial site being studied anywhere in the world. Because of how dense this particular bone is, and because of where it sits tucked safely away behind layers of skull and tissue, protected from air moisture and the outside world for thousands of years, it turned out to preserve genetic material far better than almost anywhere else in the skeleton. In some cases, dozens of times better than a rib or a tooth or a piece of arm bone. It is a strange thing to sit with, honestly. For thousands of years, this one small, unglamorous bone had been quietly protecting something extraordinary, sealed away like a message in a bottle nobody knew to look for. Once researchers understood this, the process itself became almost delicate enough to qualify as surgery. A tiny hole barely wider than a couple of grains of rice was drilled directly into that bone, carried out by specialists at the Ancient Genetics Laboratory of the Natural History Museum in London. From that hole came a small amount of fine bone powder, carefully collected, carefully sealed, and carried into one of the strictest working environments most of us will ever hear about. Ancient genetics labs are not glamorous places, whatever you might be picturing right now. They are closer to operating rooms than movie sets, and honestly, a good deal more careful than most crime dramas make forensic laboratories look. Researchers work in full protective suits in air-filtered rooms, specifically designed to keep any trace of modern human genetic material from drifting in and ruining the sample. Surfaces are cleaned constantly. Equipment is sterilized between uses in ways that would strike most of us as almost obsessive. A single stray skin cell from a careless technician, a cough even breathing too close to an open sample, can be enough to contaminate 10,000 years of preserved history beyond any hope of repair. The people doing this work spend years training simply to be trusted anywhere near a sample this fragile. Can you imagine that kind of pressure, spending years of your career building toward a single afternoon of work, knowing that one small mistake could quietly destroy the only chance anyone will ever have to properly study this particular person? 2 scientists led this particular effort at the museum, a researcher named Ian Barnes and his colleague Selina Brace, both specialists in exactly this kind of high-stakes ancient genetic work. Alongside them was a postdoctoral researcher named Tom Booth, whose focus was on how ancient humans adapted biologically to the environments they found themselves living in. Working with them from University College London were a professor named Mark Thomas and a researcher named Jon Diekman, both specialists in tracing population history through genetic patterns, the same kind of deep background work we touched on earlier tonight when we talked about where these people originally came from. None of these people arrived at this moment by accident. Each of them had spent the better part of a decade, sometimes closer to 2, building the exact combination of skills required to make a project like this even possible. Reading ancient genetic material properly is not a task you pick up quickly. It demands training in biology and statistics in the quiet, patient discipline of chemistry labs, and in archaeology itself, simply to understand what a given sample is even capable of telling you. It is worth remembering that behind every headline about a face pulled out of 10,000 years of silence, there is usually a small team of specialists who spent years of ordinary, unglamorous work simply earning the right to attempt it. Once the sample itself was successfully extracted, the next challenge was simply reading it. And this is where a genuine revolution in technology finally caught up with a 100-year-old mystery. Older genetic techniques, the kind available even just a decade or 2 earlier, could only read short, scattered fragments of code at a time, something closer to picking out single, isolated words from a badly damaged book. It was slow, it was limited, and honestly, it was rarely enough to tell you very much with any real confidence. But the technology available by the 2010s allowed researchers to read enormous stretches of genetic material all at once, catching not just isolated words but entire connected passages layered across billions of individual data points. One of the scientists involved in projects like this once compared it to finally being able to read a full chapter of an old damaged book, instead of squinting at a single surviving word and guessing at everything around it. If any of this sounds oddly familiar, it might be because a much gentler version of this exact same technology is probably sitting in a drawer somewhere in your own house right now. Those mail-order kits people spit into to learn about their ancestry, the ones that promise to tell you roughly where your great-great-grandparents came from, rely on a distant consumer-friendly cousin of the very same sequencing breakthroughs that made this particular project possible. The core idea is the same. Read enough of somebody's genetic code, compare it against enormous well-documented databases, and patterns start to emerge that no single fragment could ever reveal on its own. The difference here is scale precision, and the fact that the person being tested had been dead for 10,000 years before anyone thought to ask. Here is where things start to feel almost like science fiction, even though every part of it is grounded in careful peer-reviewed research. Scientists have spent decades studying which specific tiny variations in human genetic code tend to line up with which physical traits in living people today. Eye color, hair color, skin tone. None of these come down to a single simple switch the way old textbooks sometimes made it sound. They are the product of dozens of different genetic markers working together in combination, each one nudging the odds slightly one way or another. By comparing thousands of known genetic markers found in this ancient sample against the patterns already well documented in modern populations, researchers could calculate with a strong degree of statistical confidence what this particular set of traits was most likely to have produced in a living, breathing person. To put a number on it, roughly, researchers were confident enough in some of these particular predictions to describe them as many times more likely than the alternative based purely on how those same genetic markers behave in tens of thousands of people alive today. That is not the same as absolute certainty, and to their credit, the scientists involved were careful never to claim that it was. But it is a great deal more than a guess. It sits somewhere between a courtroom standard of reasonable doubt and a weather forecaster's confident prediction of an approaching storm grounded in real measurable patterns rather than intuition. I want to be honest with you about one thing here because I think it actually makes the achievement more impressive, not less. This was never a simple photograph pulled directly out of the bone the way headlines sometimes made it sound. It was closer to an extraordinarily well-informed prediction built from real evidence weighed against decades of established genetic research, rather than a certainty carved in stone. Good science, more often than not, looks exactly like that. Confident, careful, and honest about its own limits. Once the genetic predictions were complete, describing a set of likely traits rather than a finished picture, the project moved out of the laboratory entirely and into the hands of two Dutch brothers, Alphonse and Adrie Kennis, who had spent years building lifelike reconstructions of ancient humans for museums around the world. Working from detailed scans of the actual skull, they began the way any portrait artist might, studying bone structure, muscle attachment, points the subtle architecture that determines the shape of a living face. Then layer by careful layer, they combined that traditional sculptor's craft with the genetic predictions handed to them by the research team, adjusting skin tone, eye color, and hair texture to match what the evidence actually pointed toward rather than what tradition or assumption might have suggested. Months of work went into it. Not an illustration, not a computer rendering, a real, three-dimensional model, built with the same care a portrait sculptor might bring to a living client, except this particular client had been dead for 10,000 years. When that finished model was finally revealed to the public alongside a television documentary that aired across the country, it did not simply satisfy a piece of scientific curiosity. It truly startled people precisely because of the paradox we opened tonight's story with. Dark, richly pigmented skin, pale, strikingly blue eyes. A combination almost nobody watching at home had ever been taught to expect from anyone claiming a place in Britain's deep, distant past. Newspapers ran the finished bust on their front pages the following morning. Radio programs spent entire segments debating what it meant for how an entire nation pictured its own earliest history. For a few days at least, a face that had been missing for 10,000 years became one of the most discussed images in the country. Can I share something a little personal here? I think there is a particular kind of wonder in this story that goes beyond the science itself, and it is worth pausing on for a moment. For most of human history, once someone died, and once everyone who had actually known their face passed away as well, that person's appearance was simply gone. Erased. Unrecoverable no matter how much anyone might have wished otherwise. Portraits helped for those lucky or wealthy enough to have one made. Written descriptions helped a little more. But go back far enough past the reach of any painter or scribe and a face simply dissolves into guesswork or vanishes completely. And here, quietly, patiently, a small team of scientists managed to do something that would have sounded like pure fantasy to every single generation that came before them. They looked at a fragment of bone smaller than a coin and pulled an actual human face back out of 10,000 years of silence. Not a myth, not an artist's imagination. A face built from evidence argued over, checked and rechecked, until it stood on solid enough ground to be shown to the entire world with real confidence. If that does not feel a little bit magical to you even now, I am not sure what would. Here is a question worth sitting with while the lights are low tonight. If scientists could somehow do this with your own bones 10,000 years from now using whatever unimaginable technology exists, by then, what do you think would surprise them most? I would love to know what you imagine down in the comments before you drift off. Of course, knowing what Cheddar Man most likely looked like only answers half of the mystery we started with tonight. It tells us what was true. It does not yet tell us why it was true, why pale eyes and dark skin, a combination modern assumptions insist should never travel together, was not some rare accident but something closer to the ordinary face of an entire continent for thousands of years. And it was not just here either. Once this same careful method had been proven on one skeleton, laboratories across Europe began applying it to their own ancient burials in Spain, in Hungary, in quiet corners of the continent most people have never heard of. One skull in a Somerset cave had quietly opened a door that an entire generation of scientists would spend the next several years walking through. To understand that part properly, we need to leave the laboratory behind for a little while and talk instead about biology itself, about sunlight and diet, and the strange, slow logic that quietly shapes the human body over thousands of generations. That part of the story is where we are headed next. Let's start with something that might truly reshape how you think about your own face, and probably the faces of everyone you've ever met. Most of us grow up assuming that skin tone, eye colour and hair colour are somehow bundled together, a single package deal handed out at birth. Pale skin comes with light eyes. Dark skin comes with dark eyes. It feels almost like common sense, the kind of thing nobody ever bothers to question. Think about the last time you tried to picture a stranger based on a single description. If somebody told you a person had fair skin, chances are your mind quietly filled in the rest of the picture without even asking permission. Light hair, light eyes, the whole familiar set arriving as a package. But biology, as it turns out, does not actually work that way, and the 10,000-year-old man we've been following tonight is living undeniable proof of it. Here is the piece most people never learn in school. Skin tone and eye colour are not controlled by the same genetic instructions at all. They are governed by entirely separate systems in the body evolving on their own separate timelines, shaped by their own separate pressures. They simply happen to travel together in a lot of populations today, largely because of specific historical events we'll get to a little later tonight. But there is nothing in biology that requires them to move as a set. None whatsoever. Let's start with the eyes, because their story is honestly one of the more remarkable discoveries in modern genetics. For the overwhelming majority of human history, every single person on this planet had brown eyes. Not most people, not the majority. Essentially everyone everywhere for tens of thousands of years. Blue eyes, the kind so many of us take completely for granted today, simply did not exist as an option. Then at some point researchers now believe somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, possibly even earlier, a single tiny mutation occurred in one person, somewhere near what is now the Black Sea. It did not create a new pigment, it did something closer to the opposite. It quietly switched off part of the instructions that normally tell the iris to produce its usual rich brown colouring. Less pigment settled into that particular part of the eye, and instead of brown, the light scattered differently, producing that pale blue we associate with clear winter skies. This is not speculation dressed up as fact either. A team of researchers in Copenhagen spent years tracing the origin of this trait, comparing the genetic code of blue-eyed people across wildly different parts of the world from Denmark all the way to Turkey and Jordan. If blue eyes had appeared independently multiple separate times in different populations, you would expect to see slightly different genetic fingerprints behind each case. Instead, they found the exact same tiny stretch of code over and over in every single sample. That kind of uniformity does not happen by coincidence. It is the unmistakable signature of one single origin point, one person, one moment echoing forward through everyone who carries it today. Since that original study, newer research working directly with ancient skeletons has actually pushed the timeline back even further than anyone first suspected, suggesting the mutation itself may be considerably older than originally proposed, carried along by hunter-gatherer populations for longer than early estimates allowed. Science, as we have already seen more than once tonight, tends to keep refining its own answers as better tools come along. That is not a weakness in the method. It is precisely how the method is supposed to work. Here is the detail that truly stops people in their tracks when they hear it for the first time. Every person alive today with naturally blue eyes, every single one, carries some version of that exact same original genetic switch. Not a similar mutation that happened to occur again somewhere else. The same one. Passed down generation after generation from one shared ancestor who lived thousands of years before Britain even had ice-free ground to walk on. Take a second and actually sit with that. If you have blue eyes or you love someone who does, you're looking at the echo of one single person's genetic accident rippling forward across hundreds of generations, completely unbroken all the way to right now. And that mutation spread. It travelled with hunter-gatherer populations as they moved across the continent well before farming had even reached most of Europe, which is exactly why researchers keep finding it in skeletons this old. It was already common among people like the ones who eventually settled in Britain, carried in their blood, long before anyone had planted a single crop on this island. Skin, though, tells an entirely different story on an entirely different clock. Human skin colour is controlled by how much of a particular pigment called melanin your body produces and deposits into the outer layers of your skin. More melanin means darker skin, less means paler skin, and the amount your body makes is shaped by a handful of specific genes that, unlike that one dramatic eye colour switch, tend to shift much more slowly and gradually across generations, nudged along, not by a single accident, but by steady, patient environmental pressure over an enormous stretch of time. Here is where sunlight enters the story, and honestly, this is one of my favourite pieces of human biology, because it explains so much with such a simple mechanism. When sunlight touches human skin, it triggers the production of a nutrient the body simply cannot function properly. Without one that helps regulate calcium, supports bone strength, and keeps the immune system running the way it should. You've probably heard a doctor mention it at some point in your own life, usually while suggesting you spend a little more time outside. Darker skin rich in melanin is naturally better at blocking harmful radiation from the sun. That is a real meaningful advantage in places with intense year-round sunlight, protecting against burns and long-term skin damage. But that same protective quality also blocks some of the very sunlight the body needs to produce that nutrient in the first place. In regions where sunlight is scarce for much of the year, weak low in the sky, and often hidden behind cloud for months at a stretch, that protection can quietly become a liability instead of a benefit, leaving people vulnerable to deficiency-weakened bones and a whole cascade of health problems that would have been seriously dangerous over a long, hard winter, So slowly over thousands of years in populations living at higher latitudes with weaker, more limited sunlight, paler skin began to offer a real survival advantage. It let in more of the sunlight the body needed even when there was not very much of it available. That shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, generation by generation, the way most of evolution unfolds, patient and unglamorous. Which raises an obvious question. If pale skin offered such a clear advantage this far north, why did it take so long to show up in a place like Britain? The answer comes down to something wonderfully practical, and it connects directly to how these particular people actually lived. Vitamin production from sunlight was never the only way the human body could get what it needed. Certain foods carry meaningful amounts of it naturally, and as it happens, the hunter-gatherers we've been following tonight ate an enormous amount of exactly those foods. Oily fish pulled from rivers and coastal waters, organ meat from the deer and wild cattle they hunted, a diet built almost entirely around exactly the kinds of food that happened to be rich in this particular nutrient. In other words, their plates were quietly doing the job that in other populations eventually fell to their skin. If it helps to make this feel a little more familiar, think about the small bottle of vitamin supplements that might be sitting in your own kitchen cabinet right now, the ones so many people quietly rely on through the darker months of winter. In a strange way, these ancient hunter-gatherers were doing something remarkably similar, just without a pharmacy involved. Their supplement simply happened to be dinner. Without that dietary source, the pressure toward paler skin might have arrived here far sooner. But because these particular people were quite literally eating their way around the problem, there was simply no urgent biological need for their skin to change yet. Evolution, whatever else it is, tends to be economical. It rarely fixes a problem that food has already solved. That pressure would eventually catch up with this island, but not for thousands more years, and not for reasons connected to sunlight at all. We will get to exactly what changed and why a little further into this journey. And hair colour, if you're curious, follows yet another separate set of rules entirely shaped by its own distinct genetic pathways, its own separate pressures largely disconnected from either of the two systems we just walked through. 3 different traits, 3 different stories, 3 different timelines, all quietly unfolding inside the very same body, completely independent of one another, regardless of how neatly we like to imagine them fitting together today. Now here is something worth knowing, because I do not want you to walk away thinking this particular man in Somerset was some kind of rare exception, a strange outlier the fossil record just happened to stumble onto. He was not unusual at all. He was in almost every meaningful sense completely typical for his time. Travel south to Spain, and researchers studying a roughly 7,000-year-old skeleton found in a cave called La Bragna uncovered strikingly similar results. Dark skin, pale light-coloured eyes. Head over to Luxembourg and a hunter-gatherer known to researchers as the Lochboar individual, dated to around 8,000 years old, tells almost exactly the same story. Similar findings have turned up in Hungary as well. Different countries separated by hundreds of miles of forest and mountain and coastline that these particular people never crossed themselves. And yet genetically, biologically, they were remarkably alike, closer to distant cousins scattered across a continent than a series of unrelated coincidences. I find something quietly moving about that, honestly. A hunter along a Spanish river valley, a family sheltering in a cave in Luxembourg, a small band moving through the marshes of what is now Hungary, and a young man in a cave in Somerset, none of them ever aware the others existed, and yet all of them in a very real biological sense wearing something close to the same face. Interestingly, it was not perfectly uniform everywhere. Up in parts of Scandinavia, some hunter-gatherer populations from this same general period already carried a slightly different mix of pigmentation genes, tending towards somewhat lighter skin. earlier than their cousins further south and west. It is a reminder that human biology rarely moves in one single straight line across an entire continent all at once on cue. But across most of Western and Central Europe, the pattern our man from Guff's cave represents was not the exception. It was closer to the rule. Can we talk honestly for a moment about why almost nobody expects any of this? I think the answer says less about ancient history and more about us, about the world we personally grew up in. Most of us have only ever known a version of Europe where these traits already travel together fairly predictably, where pale skin, light eyes, and light hair tend to cluster in the same populations with a kind of reliable consistency. That pattern feels so normal, so obviously correct, that it quietly gets mistaken for a law of nature rather than what it actually is. One particular historically recent outcome built by later chapters of this same story, chapters we have not even reached yet tonight. It is a little like assuming a river has always run through the exact channel you see today, simply because that is the only version of the river you personally have ever known. Rivers move, they carve new paths, they used to run somewhere else entirely long before anyone alive today was around to see it. Or think of it this way if that comparison lands a little easier. Imagine shuffling two separate decks of cards at the same time, one for skin tone, one for eye colour, dealt out generation after generation across an entire population. For thousands of years across most of Europe, those two decks simply were not shuffled together in any consistent way. It was only later through specific historical events involving new populations, new diets, and a great deal of mixing between groups that had been separated for generations that certain combinations started appearing together, often enough to start looking to us like a fixed rule. Here is a question worth turning over quietly in your mind before we continue. If someone described your own exact combination of features, skin tone, eye colour, hair colour, height to a scientist with no other context at all, do you think they would guess your ancestry correctly? Or would they end up just as surprised as the researchers were, standing in that laboratory, looking at data that refused to match anybody's expectations? I would honestly love to know what you think if you feel like leaving a comment before you finally let your eyes close tonight. We now know what these people looked like, and we understand in real biological terms exactly why. But a face, however carefully reconstructed, is still only a single frozen moment. It cannot tell you what these people actually did with their days, how they hunted, how they built shelter, how they loved, argued, mourned, and celebrated across an ordinary human life. A skull can tell you the colour of somebody's eyes. It cannot tell you what they found funny or what frightened them, or what it felt like to fall asleep beside a fire they had built with their own hands, listening to a river they knew better than anyone alive today ever will. To understand that part of the story, we need to step away from genetics entirely and walk instead into the quiet green world these people once called home day after day, season after season, long before anyone thought to wonder what colour their eyes were. There is a particular patch of ground in what is now Yorkshire in the north of England that almost nobody outside of archaeology has ever heard of, and I think that is a genuine shame because it might be the single richest window we have into what daily life actually looked like for these people. If Cheddar Man gave us a face, this place gives us something arguably rarer. A morning, an evening. This small, unremarkable texture of an ordinary day preserved by pure geological accident for 11,000 years. For most of the Mesolithic period, this entire stretch of history, archaeologists are working almost entirely with stone. Flint tools survive, wood rots, plant fibre disintegrates, antler and bone crumble away into the soil within a few centuries, leaving researchers to reconstruct an entire way of life from little more than sharpened rocks, which is a little like trying to understand somebody's whole personality from a single photograph of their shoes. But at this particular spot beside what used to be a lake, something unusual happened. The ground stayed wet, properly permanently wet, soaked through with peat for thousands of years without ever fully drying out. And wet oxygen-starved ground turns out to be one of the best preservation environments on Earth. Wood does not rot in it. Plant fiber does not crumble. Even something as fragile as an antler carving can survive for 11,000 years, waiting patiently under the mud for somebody to finally come looking. Which is exactly what happened starting in the middle of the last century and continuing in bursts of fresh excavation ever since. Let's start with the most ordinary detail, because I think it is actually the most quietly moving one. Buried in that peat, archaeologists found the remains of an actual house. Not a vague scatter of stones that might have once supported some kind of shelter, the way so much of prehistoric archaeology works. An honest-to-goodness structure roughly circular, its floor once covered in soft reed and plant matter to keep out the cold and damp, its frame built from timber, lashed together with plant fibre and thatched over with reed. Patches of burnt flint scattered nearby mark where fires were lit meal after meal, night after night. Try to picture an ordinary evening inside it. Rain most likely tapping against a thatched roof built by hands that had done this exact job before. Smoke curling upward through a gap left for it. Someone stripping bark from a fresh branch by firelight. Another person mending a torn strip of hide. Low voices, the particular kind of comfortable quiet that only exists between people who already know each other extremely well. And here is the detail I love most. The layout suggests the house was rebuilt at least once on the same spot by people who clearly intended to come back. Can we just sit with that for a second? This was not a single desperate night spent huddled under a rock. This was a home returned to rebuilt, cared for in the same practical, quietly stubborn way any of us might return to a favourite rental cottage year after year, except this particular cottage happens to be, as far as anyone can tell, the oldest known house ever discovered in Britain. More recent excavations, carried out well over half a century after the site was first noticed, have revealed something else worth knowing. This was never just one small house beside a lake. As archaeologists have expanded their digging across the surrounding land, evidence has kept turning up of a much larger settlement than anyone originally suspected. Additional structures, additional hearths, additional debris left behind by a community considerably bigger than early researchers assumed. This was not one lonely family clinging to the edge of a lake. It was closer to a proper ongoing settlement, occupied and reoccupied across many generations. Down at the water's edge, the preservation gets even more remarkable. Researchers uncovered a wide, deliberately constructed wooden platform laid out along the old lake shore, representing the earliest known evidence of proper carpentry anywhere in Europe. Timbers were split-shaped and laid with real intention, not simply piled up in desperation. This was planned work, the kind that requires somebody to already understand which trees split cleanly, which angles hold weight, and how to make a structure that would survive being repeatedly soaked and dried across years of lake water rising and falling with the seasons. Nobody's entirely certain what the platform was used for. A walkway over marshy ground, perhaps. A place to launch a boat or clean a catch of fish, or simply stand somewhere dry while the rest of the shoreline sat waterlogged. Alongside it, archaeologists found a wooden paddle, quietly confirming what the platform already hinted at. These people were moving across that lake on purpose, not just around it, guiding some kind of small boat or raft out across open water, in search of fish, waterfowl, or simply a faster route to wherever they needed to be. Here is a question worth turning over for a moment if you feel like it. Think about the last body of water you spent real time on a lake, a river, maybe just a pool on a summer afternoon. Now imagine that same stretch of water was not a weekend activity for you, but the actual center of your entire world, the place your food came from, the place your home was built beside the place your children first learned to move safely across. Now, I want to tell you about the detail that tends to stop people cold the first time they hear it, because it moves this entire site from practical survival into something closer to belief. Scattered around the settlement, archaeologists eventually recovered more than 20 deer skulls, each one carefully modified in the exact same deliberate way. 2 holes drilled through the bone, positioned precisely where a strap or cord could pass through. The inside of each skull carefully smoothed down, clearly meant to sit comfortably against a human head. These were headdresses worn with the antlers still attached, rising up from the wearer's skull, like something between a crown and a disguise. Nobody can tell you with certainty what they were actually used for. Some researchers believe they were worn by hunters as a kind of camouflage, allowing someone to move quietly through a herd of red deer while wearing the silhouette of one of their own. Others, looking at the careful, repeated ritualistic way these objects were made, believe they represent something closer to a costume worn in ceremony, ritual or ecstatic dance, the physical evidence of the earliest form of what researchers sometimes call shamanic practice, a person stepping quite literally into the skin of an animal to reach towards something beyond the ordinary world. What makes this even more striking is that this is not an isolated idea researchers invented purely to explain a strange object. Among reindeer herding cultures in Siberia practiced right up into recent history, antler and skull headdresses, like this one, have played a documented role in exactly this kind of ceremonial spiritual practice for generations. Researchers studying the Yorkshire headdresses are not simply guessing at meaning out of thin air. They are looking at a pattern of human behaviour that has echoed in one form or another across thousands of miles and thousands of years, wherever people have lived closely alongside deer. I have to admit, this is the piece of the story that affects me the most out of everything we have covered tonight. Long before any written religion, any named god, any temple built anywhere on earth, somebody in the north of England was already reaching for the same basic human impulse that still drives so much of what we do today. A need to touch something larger than an ordinary life. A need for ritual, for meaning, for a way of marking the difference between the everyday and the sacred. And it was not the only piece of quiet artistry these people left behind. Years into excavating the site, researchers pulled a tiny object out of the mud, barely larger than a fingertip carved from a thin sliver of shale. Faint lines had been etched carefully across its surface, so worn down by time that they were almost invisible when it was first pulled from the ground, and only became visible again under careful laboratory light. Nobody agrees on what those lines represent. A tree, a map of the lake itself, a tally counting something that mattered enough to somebody 11,000 years ago to be recorded on a piece of stone small enough to wear against their own skin. Think about the effort involved for a moment. Shale is not an easy material to work with delicately. Whoever made this had to hold their hand, steady scratch by careful scratch, on an object with almost no practical use whatsoever. It could not be eaten. It could not cut anything or catch anything or keep anyone warm. Its entire purpose, as far as anyone can tell, was simply to mean something to the person who carried it. It remains the earliest known piece of art discovered anywhere in Britain, and honestly, there is something almost unbearably personal about it. Somebody sat down alone or with company and simply decided to make something beautiful for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with survival. Can I ask you something? Honestly, what do you think those lines actually meant? I have my own private guess, and I would love to hear yours down in the comments, whatever it happens to be. Of course, none of this life was gentle or easy, and it is worth being honest about that too, rather than painting an overly soft picture of the past. The animal these people hunted most seriously alongside red deer was something almost nobody today has ever seen in person, because it has been extinct for centuries. The aurochs, a wild ancestor of modern cattle, was an animal built to truly terrify. Some stood taller at the shoulder than a grown man carrying horns that could stretch out wider than an adult's outstretched arms. This was not a docile field animal waiting to be led calmly to pasture. It was closer to hunting a wild bull that had never once been tamed, fast, powerful, and entirely capable of killing a careless hunter with a single well-placed strike. Bringing one of these animals down required real coordination, real patience, and a fairly serious amount of courage working together as a group rather than as a lone hero with a spear using weapons tipped with antler that archaeologists have recovered by the hundreds from this single site alone. And when the meat was not available or simply was not enough on its own, the forest itself quietly filled in the gaps. Hazelnuts in particular turn up again and again in the archaeological layers here, sometimes in remarkably large quantities, many of them scorched from roasting over an open fire. There is even evidence that these particular people were doing something we do not usually credit hunter-gatherers with attempting, deliberately setting small controlled fires to clear patches of woodland, encouraging hazel trees to spread more thickly the following season. That is not passive foraging. That is a community actively shaping its own landscape generation after generation to make the following year's harvest a little more certain than the last. They were not, in other words, simply wandering through a wilderness hoping to get lucky. They were reading it, managing it quietly, bending it toward their own survival, the way any of us might learn to work with a particular patch of ground behind our own house. And they were not alone in the ordinary sense either. Alongside the human remains at settlements like this one, archaeologists have also found the bones of dogs among the earliest evidence of domesticated dogs living alongside people anywhere in Britain. These were not wild animals tolerated at a distance. Studies of what these dogs actually ate suggest they shared meals, with the people around them fed deliberately, rather than left to scavenge on their own. Which means that on any given evening beside that fire, beside that lake, there was very likely a dog curled up somewhere close by, fed by hand, trusted enough to sleep near the children, exactly the way one might be curled up somewhere near you tonight. Here is what I find myself thinking about most when I picture this particular corner of the past. Not the danger of the hunt or the cold of an English winter real, as both of those things certainly were. I think about the ordinary texture of an evening here. Smoke rising gently from a rebuilt house, a dog stretched out near the fire, somebody quietly, patiently scratching faint lines into a small piece of stone for no reason except that it felt worth doing. It is easy from thousands of years away to imagine the deep past as nothing but hardship, a grim grey struggle against cold and hunger, with no room left over for anything gentler. This place quietly argues otherwise. There was danger here, certainly. But there was also home. There was also art. There was also unmistakably a kind of joy, the ordinary, unremarkable joy of a life lived alongside people and animals you had chosen to keep close. I would love to know honestly if that surprises you as much as it surprised me the first time I came across this place. I think most of us are taught without ever being told directly to picture our ancient ancestors as grim and joyless, permanently hunched against the cold. The evidence quite plainly tells a warmer story. For a while now, this has felt like a warm chapter in the story, hasn't it? A home rebuilt with care, a lake full of food, a community finding beauty even in the smallest, most ordinary object. I wanted you to sit inside that warmth for a little while, because it makes what comes next considerably harder to hear. Not every part of the world these people built for themselves was going to survive. Somewhere beyond the edge of that lake, past the forests and the rivers, we have spent tonight walking through an entire landscape, these people depended on was quietly living on borrowed time, and none of them had any way of knowing it. Let's go find that borrowed time now, because it deserves to be told properly without rushing past it. We have mentioned this particular stretch of ground once or twice already tonight, almost in passing, as the low green land that once joined Britain to the rest of Europe. But I think it deserves far more than a passing mention, because for thousands of years it was not some empty strip of mud connecting one important place to another. It was by every measure archaeologists can reconstruct one of the richest, most generous landscapes in the whole of prehistoric Europe. Wide rivers threading through it, freshwater lakes thick with fish, salt marshes alive with waterfowl, forests full of red deer, wild boar, and the same fearsome aurochs we talked about not long ago. Ancient genetic traces pulled from that same seabed have even confirmed bears living there alongside all the rest. Modern researchers who study it now sometimes only half joke that if you had to choose anywhere in Mesolithic Europe to actually live, this particular stretch of ground might have been the single best address available. Today, almost none of it exists. But the story of exactly how we came to know that is worth telling properly, because it began of all places on the deck of an ordinary fishing boat. On a September night in 1931, a trawler called the Calinda was working the water roughly 25 miles off the coast of Norfolk, dragging her nets along the seabed the way trawlers always had. When the crew hauled their catch up that night, tangled among the fish was a large, unremarkable lump of dark peat, the kind fishermen in that area saw constantly and usually tossed straight back over the side without a second thought. The ship's skipper, a man named Pilgrim Lockwood, picked up his shovel to break the clump apart before throwing it overboard. When the shovel struck something inside it, he later said it sounded like hitting metal. It was not metal. Wiped clean, it turned out to be a beautifully made antler harpoon, carved with a row of sharp barbs along one edge, clearly shaped by human hands. When experts eventually examined it, they placed its age squarely within the Mesolithic period. We have spent this whole night exploring a tool made by someone very much like the people we've been following lost or discarded on solid dry ground, at a spot that now sits more than 100 feet underwater in the middle of the open North Sea. That single object pulled up almost by accident on an ordinary night's work quietly confirmed something scientists had only been able to guess at before. An entire landscape really had once stretched out beneath what is now open ocean, and people had truly lived there, hunted there, lost tools there, going about ordinary lives in a place that does not even exist on a modern map. In the decades since trawlers working that same stretch of sea have periodically dragged up more other tools, other fragments of antler and bone, even on occasion the remains of animals that vanished from Britain entirely thousands of years ago, all of it resting quietly on a seabed that used to be somebody's home. Here is the part of this story that surprises almost everyone the first time they hear it properly, and honestly it surprised me too. This was not one single sudden catastrophe. It is tempting when you first hear that an entire landmass vanished beneath the sea, to picture one terrible afternoon, one great wave, one clean dramatic ending. The truth is quieter than that, and in its own way considerably sadder. For centuries, as the ice we spent so much of tonight discussing continued melting further north, sea levels kept rising slowly, relentlessly, a matter of inches added year after year, rather than any single dramatic surge. Picture a very slow, very patient tide that simply never fully went back out. Rivers that had once run for miles inland became shorter. Forests along the coast began dying as salt water crept steadily into their roots. Trees left standing bare and grey, killed slowly from the roots upward long after the leaves had any reason to return. Islands began forming where solid ground had stood for generations. Familiar hunting paths walked by grandfather and father and son alike quietly became unusable, swallowed a little further each spring. This was not something any single person would have noticed happening within their own lifetime. It was something a grandmother might have quietly mentioned to her granddaughter, gesturing toward water that had not been there when she herself was young. Can you imagine watching your own home shrink like that so gradually that you almost cannot point to the exact moment it started, only to the fact that it clearly, undeniably kept happening? There is a second, quieter reason behind all of this too, one most people never learn. It was not only that the sea itself was rising everywhere on Earth as the ice melted. This particular stretch of land was also very slowly sinking. As the enormous weight of ice pressing down on Scotland and Scandinavia for thousands of years finally lifted the ground beneath those regions, began rising back up the way a mattress slowly rises again after you finally stand up off it. But the Earth's crust does not simply spring back evenly all at once everywhere. As the north rose, the land further south, precisely where this rich low-lying territory sat, was gently tilting downward in response, like one end of a very long, very slow seesaw lifting while the other end quietly dropped, rising water from one direction, sinking ground from another. This particular landscape, in other words, was being squeezed from both sides at once, and nobody living there had any concept of tectonic geology to explain why the water simply kept winning. By around 8,000 years ago, what had once been a broad, continuous homeland had been reduced to something closer to a scattered archipelago, a scattering of low islands poking up out of an increasingly hostile sea, connected to what remained of the mainland only by memory and the occasional stretch of exposed mud at low tide. And then one particular day something happened that had nothing to do with slow patient tides at all. Far to the north off the coast of what is now Norway, an enormous section of seabed, roughly comparable in size to the whole of Scotland, suddenly gave way and slid downward into the deep ocean. Geologists call it the Storegga Slide, and it remains one of the largest submarine landslides ever identified anywhere on the planet. When that much material collapses that quickly underwater, it does not settle quietly. It displaces an almost unimaginable volume of ocean water, outward all at once in every direction. The result was a tsunami on a scale modern Britain has essentially never experienced in recorded history. Waves are believed to have reached considerable heights as they crossed the open sea, and when that wall of water finally reached land, it struck the coastlines of Norway, the Shetland Islands, the Faroe Islands, eastern Scotland, and whatever remained of that shrinking low-lying territory in between. Researchers have identified physical traces of it, thick, unmistakable layers of sand and marine sediment sitting on top of what were once solid, dry living surfaces as far apart as the coast of Scotland and the shores of Greenland, buried under later soil like a scar the land never quite managed to heal over. Geologists studying modern Britain generally consider this the single largest natural disaster the region has experienced in roughly 11,000 years. Think about what that actually meant for whoever remained on those last scattered islands. People whose entire understanding of the world was built around rivers, forests, and a coastline that moved slowly, predictably over the course of a lifetime. And then, without any real warning at all, a wall of water taller than most buildings we walk past every day arrived in a matter of minutes. And for however many people were living in its path that particular morning, an entire world simply ended. I want to be honest with you here the way I have tried to be honest throughout tonight, because the story keeps refining itself the more carefully researchers look. Newer studies now suggest that this tsunami likely was not the single moment that erased every last trace of this territory. Some of the higher ground remnants that would eventually become an underwater feature we now call Dogger Bank appear to have survived the wave itself, clinging on, as isolated islands together, roughly comparable in size to the whole of Wales, for possibly another 1,000 years or more, before the slow patient tide we talked about earlier finally finished the job. In some strange way, I find that detail even sadder than a single clean ending would have been. It means that whatever handful of people survived that particular morning did not get to rebuild a lost world. They got to watch the remains of it keep disappearing piece by piece for the rest of their lives and hand that same slow, losing fight down to their own children. Here is something else worth sitting with because it makes the timing of all of this feel even more brutal. Around the exact same period as this tsunami, researchers have identified a sudden sharp cooling event that swept across the entire northern hemisphere, most likely triggered by an enormous flood of fresh cold water pouring out of a collapsing glacial lake somewhere over in what is now North America, disrupting ocean currents that the whole climate of this region quietly depended on. Temperatures dropped in some places sharply enough to be felt within a single lifetime, right at the exact moment survivors most needed reliable seasons, predictable herds and forests that had not just been poisoned by salt water and stripped bare by a wave. In other words, whoever survived that wave was not simply left to rebuild in peace afterward. They were left to survive a truly brutal cold snap as well, arriving at almost precisely the same moment, on top of everything they had already lost. It feels important to say clearly before we move any further that the people living through this were not strangers to us tonight. They were not some separate, forgotten population unconnected to everything else we have spent this evening exploring. They were part of the very same broad community we have followed from the moment the ice first retreated cousins, in every meaningful sense of the people who built that house beside the lake in Yorkshire, who hunted aurochs with antler-tipped weapons, who carved careful lines into a small piece of shale for reasons that had nothing to do with survival. Some of them likely traded with those very families married into them, shared the same rivers during migration season, followed the same herds of deer across the same open ground. Some of them almost certainly shared that same striking combination we spent so long discussing earlier tonight. Dark skin, pale eyes, faces we would recognize as deeply unmistakably human, caught in the middle of losing absolutely everything. Can I ask you something honestly while we sit with that for a moment? What do you think it would actually feel like watching the coastline of your own home quietly retreat year after year for your entire life the way theirs did? Would you keep hoping it might stop? Would you start preparing to leave long before you actually needed to? I honestly do not know what I would do, and I suspect most of us never will, unless we're unlucky enough to find out firsthand. I would love to hear what you think down in the comments before you finally close your eyes tonight. There is no monument to any of this, no grave marker, no named victims, no solemn anniversary observed anywhere in the world today. No museum wing, no plaque on any coastline, no annual ceremony to mark what was almost certainly one of the deadliest single mornings in the entire history of this island. Just the occasional flint tool or one remarkable antler harpoon pulled up by accident in a fishing net somewhere in the middle of the North Sea, a small silent reminder that an entire world full of ordinary people, living ordinary lives, families' arguments, laughter, worry simply went under the water, and mostly history simply moved on without them. I think that is worth remembering honestly the next time any of us feels certain that the ground beneath our own feet is permanent. Somewhere under 100 feet of cold grey water tonight, there are still hearths that were never allowed to properly go cold, tools dropped mid-task, footprints pressed into ground. Nobody ever got the chance to walk back across. For the people who did survive, scattered along whatever coastline remained solid enough to stand on life, did not simply pause to mourn what had been lost. It had to continue immediately under conditions considerably harsher than anything their parents or grandparents had ever faced. New camps had to be built. New hunting grounds had to be learned quickly by people who had spent their entire lives mastering a landscape that no longer existed. Whatever grief they carried, and I suspect it was considerable, it had to sit alongside the ordinary unglamorous work of simply staying alive through another winter, and soon enough, measured against the scale of everything we have covered tonight, an entirely different kind of change was already gathering on the horizon. Not tides or landslides or vanishing coastlines this time, but something quieter, slower, and in its own way every bit as total. A change that would not come from the sea at all, but from other people arriving from somewhere else, entirely carrying with them an idea about how to live that this island had never once seen before. Let's talk about exactly what that idea was, because it deserves real care in the telling, not a rushed summary. Everything we have followed so far tonight, every single person we've met has belonged to the same basic way of living. Follow the herds, watch the rivers, take what a season is willing to offer and move on when it stops offering enough. For roughly 6,000 years after the ice first pulled back, that was simply what life in Britain meant. Nobody planted anything on purpose. Nobody owned a permanent field. Nobody woke up in the morning already knowing exactly what the next several months of their life would look like, because a wild landscape rarely allows for that kind of certainty. Then somewhere around 6,000 years ago, that entire premise quietly stopped being true, and it did not happen, because the people already living here decided to change their minds. To understand where this shift actually came from, we have to go back much further than Britain itself, all the way to the hills of Anatolia, the region that makes up much of modern-day Turkey. It was there thousands of years earlier still that certain wild grasses were first deliberately planted, harvested and replanted, generation after generation, slowly turning into the wheat and barley we would recognize today. Sheep and goats were tamed there as well, not simply hunted opportunistically, but kept bred and relied upon. This was not a single invention, some brilliant flash of insight from one particularly clever individual. It was a slow accumulation of small decisions repeated by countless people over countless seasons, each one only slightly adjusting what came before, that eventually added up to something entirely new in human history. The ability to plan with real confidence exactly what next year's harvest would probably look like. That idea did not stay in one place. It travelled carried not by chance or accident, but by actual people, migrating outward from the region, where it began carrying their crops, their animals, and their entire worldview along with them. Here is where the geography gets truly interesting, and it connects directly to something we've already spent time discussing tonight. There were two broad routes this new way of life took as it spread across Europe. One moved inland following the great river valleys of Central Europe, spreading steadily overland. The other moved by sea, hugging the Mediterranean coastline island, hopping and coast crawling its way west, eventually reaching the Iberian Peninsula, the same stretch of Spain and Portugal we already know sheltered hunter-gatherer populations during the very coldest centuries of the Ice Age. From there, this second route continued north, up along the Atlantic coastline of what is now France, edging closer and closer to the narrow stretch of water separating the continent from Britain. It was this second route, the long patient coast hugging one, that eventually brought farming to this island. Not overland from the nearest neighbouring shore, but by a far longer, more roundabout Mediterranean journey, stretching back thousands of miles to hills in Anatolia that the people carrying this idea had likely never personally seen themselves. Here is a genuine mystery worth sitting with for a moment one archaeologists still argue about today. Farming had already been established just across the water, in what is now northern France and Belgium, for something close to an entire 1,000 years before it finally reached Britain. An entire millennium. Generation after generation of farmers living within sight of the sea, apparently making no serious attempt to cross it, while people on the other side continued living exactly as their ancestors always had. Why the delay? Nobody has a fully satisfying answer. Perhaps the crossing itself felt too dangerous to risk with livestock and seed grain aboard a gamble not worth taking, while the mainland still offered plenty of unclaimed easier ground to farm instead. Perhaps existing trade contact between hunter-gatherers and nearby farming communities meant there was no urgent need yet some exchange of goods or knowledge, quietly smoothing over the difference without anyone needing to relocate. Perhaps, and I find this explanation strangely human, it simply took that long for enough people to work up the nerve, the same way a truly good idea can sit untouched for a generation, before somebody finally decides the risk is worth taking. Whatever finally tipped the balance around 6,000 years ago, boats began crossing that channel, carrying considerably more than just curious travellers. Try to picture the actual undertaking involved, because I think we tend to skip past this part too quickly. These were not casual day trips. Whoever made that crossing had to load a small, likely hide-covered wooden vessel with livestock that did not want to be there, sacks of seed grain that represented an entire future harvest, and tools for building an entirely new kind of life, all while crossing open water, using nothing but human effort, and whatever weather happened to cooperate that particular day. Imagine standing on that shoreline watching the boat being loaded, a frightened goat, legs bound, bleating against the strangeness of it all. Woven bags of grain kept carefully dry, representing not just food, but the entire following year the difference between a settlement and a failure. Children almost certainly tucked in somewhere among the cargo, watching their only home shrink behind them as the far coastline slowly grew larger ahead. One bad storm, one panicked animal, one soaked and ruined sack of grain, and the entire voyage could have ended in complete failure before a single field was ever planted. Whoever did this successfully was not simply adventurous. They were in the most literal sense gambling everything on an idea, and once they arrived, something happened that has quietly reshaped how historians think about this entire period of British history. Careful genetic analysis of skeletons from this period compared directly against the hunter-gatherer remains we have spent so much of tonight discussing tells an almost startling story. The people who suddenly appear in Britain's archaeological record around this time carry overwhelmingly Anatolian-derived ancestry, the same genetic signature found in early farmers all across the Mediterranean route we just traced. Researchers estimate somewhere around 3/4 of their genetic makeup traces directly back to those distant Anatolian farming communities, with only a modest trace of older hunter-gatherer ancestry mixed in, most of which appears to have already been absorbed into the farming population somewhere back along that long Mediterranean route, rather than freshly acquired here in Britain itself. And critically, there is very little evidence in the genetic record, at least, of meaningful mixing between these newcomers and the hunter-gatherer population that had called this island home for 6,000 years before them. Let that sit for a moment, because it is a remarkably strange finding. This was not a slow blending of two neighbouring communities gradually growing closer over the generations the way you might expect two nearby populations to eventually intermingle. It looks instead considerably closer to a replacement. Within what appears to be a remarkably short span of time, the dominant genetic signature across Britain shifts almost entirely from one population to another, with barely a genetic trace of the people who'd been here first. And it was not only their bloodline that shifted, their faces changed too. where the hunter-gatherers we have followed for most of tonight carried that striking combination of dark skin and pale eyes. These incoming farmers typically carried brown eyes and a noticeably lighter, more intermediate skin tone closer to what many of us might picture as a familiar European appearance today. Stand the two side by side if such a thing was somehow possible, and you would likely assume you were looking at two entirely unrelated peoples from opposite ends of a continent, rather than two populations who occupied the exact same stretch of British ground within a handful of generations of one another. In the span of a few centuries, the most common face in Britain flipped almost entirely from one set of features to something close to its opposite. Here is the question that truly keeps researchers up at night, and I mean that with real respect for how difficult it has been to answer. How does a population replacement this thorough happen without leaving behind the kind of evidence we would normally expect from a violent conquest? Archaeologists have searched carefully for the usual signs: mass graves, burned settlements, weapon trauma on a meaningful scale spread across the right time period, and overwhelmingly they have not found it, at least not at anywhere near the scale you would expect from a population being wiped out or driven off by force. Whatever happened here, it does not look on the surface like a war. So researchers have proposed several other possibilities instead, and honestly, I find all three worth taking seriously rather than picking just one favourite. The first is disease. Farmers living in permanent settlements alongside penned livestock tend to develop and carry a very different set of illnesses than small mobile hunter-gatherer bands ever would, illnesses that emerge specifically from prolonged close contact with domesticated animals in a way hunting an occasional wild deer simply never produces. It is entirely possible that these newcomers brought infections with them that hunter-gatherer immune systems had never once been exposed to quietly and invisibly devastating local populations, well before a single field was even planted nearby, moving ahead of the farmers themselves along trade contacts and chance encounters, the way illness so often travels faster than the people carrying it. The second is something closer to simple demographic arithmetic, and it is honestly the explanation I find myself drawn to the most. Farming, whatever its downsides, allows a population to grow considerably faster than hunting and gathering ever can. More reliable food closer together, supporting more children surviving to adulthood generation after generation. It is entirely possible that no dramatic conflict was needed at all. The farming population may have simply outgrown the hunter-gatherer population within a handful of generations, the way a fast-growing plant can quietly crowd out a slower one without a single dramatic moment anyone would think to record. Interestingly, this pattern was not universal, and that inconsistency actually helps confirm how real it was. In parts of Eastern Europe around the Baltic, the same transition unfolded far more gradually, with considerably more genetic mixing between farmers and the hunter-gatherers already living there. Whatever happened in Britain and much of Western Europe, sudden, thorough, and strangely quiet, was not simply how farming always spread wherever it went. Something about the specific circumstances here made the outcome considerably more one-sided. The third possibility is more social than biological. Perhaps the two groups simply never meaningfully integrated, living close to one another for a period without ever truly merging by choice or by mutual unfamiliarity, until the older population, smaller to begin with, simply thinned out on its own generation after generation, without anyone ever needing to force the outcome directly. The honest answer, the one serious researchers keep returning to, is that it was very likely some combination of all three, playing out differently in different corners of the island, over a span of time too long and too quiet for any single dramatic story to properly capture. Can I share something honestly personal here before we move on? I find this particular chapter oddly harder to sit with than the tsunami we spent so long discussing earlier tonight. A sudden wave, however devastating at least, has a villain of sorts, a clear moment, an obvious before and after, something a person could point to and say, this is exactly when everything changed. This is something else entirely. A population disappearing so quietly, so gradually that nobody at the time may have fully registered it happening as a single event at all. No clear villain, no clear victims to name, no clear cause to point toward with any confidence. Just one way of life fading out generation by generation, while an entirely different one quietly filled the space it left behind, the way water fills a footprint left in wet sand patiently, without any drama at all, until the footprint simply is not there anymore. I think that quiet quality is precisely what makes it so unsettling. We are trained by nearly every story we grow up with to expect endings to announce themselves. A battle, a villain, a single decisive moment worth naming and remembering. This ending refused to do any of that, and maybe that refusal is exactly why so few people outside of archaeology have ever heard about it. Here is something worth turning over in your own mind for a moment if you're still awake enough to consider it. Do you think a population can truly vanish in every meaningful sense without a single act of violence ever being committed against it? I am honestly not sure I know the answer, and I would love to hear what you think down in the comments whenever you get the chance. What we do know is that the people who arrived on these boats did not simply want to survive on this island. They wanted to leave a permanent mark on it, quite literally in stone, in a way nobody living here had ever attempted before. Enormous earthworks, long carefully built tombs meant to hold generations of the dead at once. The earliest stirrings of a monument that would eventually become one of the most famous structures on the entire planet. Where the people before them had built with reed and antler and timber structures meant to last a season, a lifetime at most, these newcomers began building for permanence itself, as though determined to prove in a way their predecessors never had that they intended to stay. And some of what they built has managed to survive standing quietly in fields and hillsides across Britain for nearly 6,000 years, waiting for us to finally ask what it actually meant to the people who raised it. Here is where the story slows down for a while, and honestly I think it has earned the rest. Everything we have covered so far tonight has moved quickly. Waves of people arriving, disappearing, replacing one another across thousands of years. But the farmers who crossed that channel and settled into this island did not spend the next several centuries simply repeating the same pattern of upheaval. They stayed, they built, and what they eventually left behind, scattered across the chalk hills of what is now southern England, still quietly shapes how millions of visitors picture ancient Britain today, long after almost everything else we have discussed tonight has vanished without a trace. Let's start somewhere most people have actually never heard of, because I think it explains everything that comes after it far better than jumping straight to the famous Stones Wood. Scattered across the countryside of Wiltshire, farmers of this period built enormous earthworks, known today as causewayed enclosures, wide rings of ditch and bank broken up by numerous gaps or causeways, rather than forming one continuous barrier. One of the best studied sites atop a gentle rise called Windmill Hill, offering a wide sweeping view across miles of surrounding chalkland, and for a long time archaeologists truly struggled to explain what it was actually for. It clearly was not a defensive fort. The multiple breaks in the ditch would have made it useless for keeping anyone out. It was not a settlement either, at least not in any permanent everyday sense. No dense clusters of houses, no thick layers of ordinary domestic rubbish built up over generations, the kind you would expect from a place people simply lived. What excavators eventually found inside those ditches gave them the answer, and it is not a comfortable one by modern standards, though I would gently encourage you not to flinch away from it. Considerable quantities of human bone turned up, their bone that had clearly not been carefully buried, but left exposed out in the open air, allowed to naturally decompose over time, likely on raised platforms, or simply laid out across open ground where whether open air and scavenging birds could do their slow, patient work. Archaeologists call this practice excarnation, and it appears to have been a deliberate, considered choice, not neglect. The dead were laid out somewhere open, given back gradually to weather and scavenger, and only afterward, once the flesh was gone, were certain bones selected and gathered for a different, more permanent kind of resting place. These same enclosures likely served other purposes too, gathering places where scattered farming families came together seasonally to trade, arrange marriages, share news, and feast the pottery and animal bone found alongside the human remains, suggesting considerable communal activity beyond funeral rites alone. Death, in other words, was not kept separate from ordinary life here. It sat right alongside trade gossip and celebration, all happening on the very same patch of open ground. I know that might sound unsettling if you have never encountered it before, so let me offer a comparison that might make it feel less alien. This exact practice, exposing the dead so that only clean bone remains, still exists today quite openly in parts of the world. Certain remote Buddhist communities in Tibet still practice something very similar, commonly known as sky burial. Zoroastrian communities in parts of India have followed a related tradition for centuries as well, believing that returning a body to open air rather than sealing it into the earth avoids contaminating ground they consider sacred. What looks strange to us tonight, in other words, was never some crude, primitive oddity. It was simply one more thoughtful, deliberate answer to a question every human culture eventually has to face. What do we actually owe the people we have lost, and where did those carefully selected bones eventually go once the excarnation process was complete? That question brings us to the second great structure these farmers built across this same landscape, the Long Barrow. And I want to tell you about one specific example, because I think its details say more than any general description could. Not far from Windmill Hill, farmers raised an enormous earthen mound now known as West Kennet Long Barrow, built somewhere around 3,600 years before the Common Era, using an estimated 15,000 hours of collective labour, an extraordinary commitment from a community that almost certainly had no shortage of other more immediately pressing work to do. The finished structure stretched impressively long across the landscape, its entrance marked by massive standing stones set into a facade deliberately imposing the kind of architecture clearly meant to announce from a considerable distance that something important lay inside. Inside a series of stone-lined chambers held the remains of roughly 50 individuals gathered there gradually across generations rather than all at once, alongside careful offerings of pottery beads and worked tools left beside them. Here is the detail that truly surprised me the first time I came across it, and I think it might surprise you too. When archaeologists carefully studied exactly which bones were present inside that chamber, they noticed something distinctly uneven. Skulls in particular, along with the long bones of the arms and legs, were noticeably underrepresented compared to what a complete set of 50 skeletons should have contained. The most likely explanation is almost tender if you sit with it for a moment. Certain bones, probably the most personally significant ones, may have been deliberately removed again, after burial carried elsewhere, perhaps to be used in ongoing ceremonies, perhaps kept by grieving families as something closer to a keepsake, or perhaps brought along when a family group eventually moved on to new ground, taking a literal physical piece of their ancestors with them. Can you imagine that for a moment an ancestor's bone deliberately kept handled, perhaps even carried from settlement to settlement, generation after generation, the way some families today still keep a grandmother's ring or a father's watch passed down, not for its practical use, but because of exactly whose hands once held it? Maybe you have something like that yourself tucked away in a drawer, somewhere worth more to you than its material would ever suggest, purely because of who it once belonged to. These farmers, it turns out, were doing something remarkably similar, just with considerably higher stakes and considerably more ceremony attached to it. Archaeologists studying this entire period increasingly believe these farming communities practice something close to a genuine ancestor cult, a belief that the spirits of the dead had not simply departed, but remained quietly present, capable of interceding on behalf of the living, watching over the harvest, the herds, the health of a struggling community. This makes a certain intuitive sense if you think about what farming actually demands of a person. A hunter-gatherer band could pack up and move whenever a particular stretch of forest stopped providing enough. A farmer could not. A farmer had committed to a single patch of ground, planted seed in it, waited months for a return, and needed that same ground to keep producing year after year for the rest of their life, and ideally for their children's lives as well. Land was not simply farmed here. It was inherited spiritually as much as practically tied directly to the people who had worked it, died on it, and in a very real sense never fully left it. Which brings us finally to the site most of you have almost certainly been waiting for, the one structure standing at the very center of this entire ritual landscape, surrounded on every side by exactly the kind of tombs and gathering places we have just spent time exploring. On a stretch of open chalk plain in what is now Wiltshire, roughly 5,000 years ago, this same farming community began digging a large circular ditch, piling the excavated chalk into banks on either side, enclosing a space more than 100 meters across. The freshly cut chalk would have gleamed almost white against the surrounding green, visible from a considerable distance, an unmistakable statement carved directly into the landscape. 2 deliberate gaps were left in that circular boundary, and the larger of the 2 tellingly faced almost precisely toward the point on the horizon where the sun rises on the longest day of the year. Whoever planned this was not simply digging a ditch at random. They were building something oriented quite literally around the turning of the seasons, timed to a rhythm the sky itself had been quietly teaching farming communities to respect for generations. Inside that enclosure, workers dug a ring of 56 pits later, named the Aubrey Holes, after the 17th century antiquarian who first identified them, each one roughly a metre across, arranged with a precision that still impresses engineers studying the site today. For hundreds of years afterward, this space functioned primarily as a cemetery, specifically for cremated remains, making it, by some estimates, the largest known burial ground anywhere in Britain from that entire era. Picture it functioning that way for a moment, generation after generation of families returning to this same open field, carrying the ashes of someone they loved, entrusting them to ground that had already received the ashes of countless others before them. This was not yet the dramatic ring of towering stones you're almost certainly picturing right now. For its first several centuries of use, Stonehenge was something considerably quieter, a circular earthwork, a field of burial pits, a place where the ashes of the dead were entrusted to ground carefully aligned with the movement of the sun overhead. These stones themselves, the ones that eventually made this site famous around the entire world, came later, roughly 500 years after that first ditch was dug, sometime close to 2,500 years before the Common Era. Dozens of massive sarsen stones, some weighing as much as several dozen tons apiece, were hauled from chalk downs many miles away, dragged most likely on wooden sledges over rollers by teams of people working in careful, coordinated effort, then shaped using nothing but harder stone hammers, and finally raised upright into the arrangement that still stands today, an engineering achievement so demanding that some estimates place the total labour involved in the millions of hours. Smaller bluestones hauled an even more astonishing distance from hills in Wales over 150 miles away by the shortest possible route were worked into the design as well. evidence of trade networks, or at the very least shared cultural connections, stretching far beyond what any single community could have managed alone. Whether those stones were carried the entire distance by careful human effort, floated part of the way along rivers and coastline, or moved by some combination of both remains actively debated among researchers today, and honestly I find the fact that we still cannot fully answer that question, even now almost as fascinating as the stones themselves. Here is something worth sitting with quietly for a moment, because I think it deserves real weight, rather than a passing mention. The community that finally raised those enormous stones, completing a monument their own ancestors had begun laying out 5 centuries earlier, was in a very real sense putting the finishing touches on their own civilization's greatest achievement at almost exactly the same moment. Something else entirely unrelated to sunlight or seasons or ancestors was already beginning to stir across the sea. Can I ask you something honestly while we sit with that? Do you think the people who finally raised those great stones had any idea they were completing a monument, rather than beginning one that later generations of their own descendants would continue to build upon? Did they feel a sense of quiet triumph, looking up at what they had finally finished? Or were they already worrying about the next season's harvest, already moving on to the next piece of ordinary life, the way most of us do, even after our own proudest achievements? I find myself hoping they at least got that one moment of pure, uncomplicated pride, whatever came afterward. I would love to know what you imagine down in the comments before you close your eyes tonight. For now though, let's stay here a little longer in the quiet, settled world these farmers built for themselves. Fields worked by families who expected their grandchildren to work the very same ground. Ancestors kept close, sometimes literally, in careful bone and careful memory. A monument aligned not toward conquest or defense, but toward the sun itself, marking the turning of a year these people had learned to predict with real confidence. Smoke rising from settled hearths that had stood in the same spot for generations, rather than being rebuilt fresh with every migration. Children who would grow old and die within sight of the very same hill their great-grandparents had once been buried beneath. Compared to almost everything else we have covered tonight, Ice Age's drowned coastlines, quiet population replacements, this particular chapter feels almost peaceful, doesn't it? A community finally settling in, believing as most settled communities eventually do, that the ground beneath them belonged to them permanently. I want you to hold on to that feeling for just a little while longer, because it will not last. Something was already crossing toward this island by the time those final stones were lifted into place, carrying with it metal these farmers had never worked, animals bred for entirely different purposes, and a set of customs that would once again quietly and almost completely change whose blood ran through these fields. Let's follow that crossing now all the way back to where it actually began, because the starting point is considerably further away than you might expect. Thousands of miles east of Stonehenge, out on the open grassland stretching between the Black Sea and the Caspian, a very different kind of people had been living for generations, herding cattle and sheep across enormous distances, following the grass the way earlier hunters had once followed deer. Researchers today call them the Yamnaya, and what set them apart from nearly everyone else at the time was not simply what they raised, but how far they could suddenly travel with it. 2 inventions changed everything for them: the domesticated horse and a truly new piece of technology, the wheeled cart. Together, those 2 things meant a family could pack up an entire household, herd included, and move faster and farther than almost any other population on the planet at that moment in history. Their burial mounds, enormous earthen tumuli still visible across the steppe today, speak to a society organized very differently from the quiet, Communal farming villages we spent the last while exploring, one built instead around individual status mobility, and quite often the horse itself, and move they did. Starting somewhere around 5,300 years ago, waves of people carrying this Yamnaya ancestry began spreading outward from the steppe in almost every direction, at once eventually reaching as far east as Mongolia, as far south as India, and as far west as the Atlantic coast of Europe. If that sounds like an exaggeration, I promise you it is not. Geneticists have traced the fingerprints of this single migration across an almost unbelievable stretch of the modern world, and it happens to explain something you have personally been using your entire life without ever realizing it. Most of the languages spoken today across Europe, and a considerable number spoken across South Asia as well, English very much included, ultimately trace back to a single ancient language family. Linguists have called it Indo-European for a long time, long before genetics could actually prove where it came from. It is only fairly recently that ancient genetic evidence has confirmed what many linguists had already quietly suspected. The people carrying this language or an early ancestor of it were very likely these same steppe herders, riding and rolling their way across an entire continent, carrying their words along with their cattle. It shows up in strange small ways if you know where to look. The English word for mother sits remarkably close to related words in Hindi and Russian, in Persian languages separated today by thousands of miles, and entirely different alphabets. That is not coincidence. That is a shared root planted somewhere on that same steppe that simply grew differently as it spread in every direction. Here is a strange thing to sit with if you feel like it. Whatever language your own grandparents spoke wherever in Europe or South Asia your own family happens to trace back to, there is a real chance a piece of that language's deepest root passed through these exact same grasslands, carried by people who never once imagined their speech would still be shaping conversations, 5,000 years later, on an island most of them had probably never even heard of. By the time this expansion reached Western Europe, it had picked up a new identity along the way. One archaeologists know by the objects it left behind rather than any name these people used for themselves. Researchers call it the bell beaker culture, named for a distinctive bell-shaped pottery vessel, found buried again and again alongside the dead across an enormous stretch of the continent from Portugal to Poland. Alongside those pots, graves from this period typically contain copper daggers, arrowheads, stone wrist guards worn to protect an archer's forearm from the snap of a bowstring, and small decorative buttons, a consistent enough package of belongings that archaeologists sometimes half-jokingly compare it to a kind of prehistoric brand identity, recognizable wherever it turns up, whether that happens to be Spain, Germany, or a quiet field in the south of England. Interestingly, the pottery style itself appears to have first emerged in Iberia, considerably closer to the Atlantic edge of Europe than to the steppe itself. But the people who eventually carried this entire cultural package into Britain came predominantly from populations further east already carrying substantial steppe ancestry, picked up through generations of mixing across Central Europe. The pots may have started in one place. The people wearing them by the time they reached this island came from somewhere else, entirely a reminder that culture and genetics do not always travel along quite the same road. Let me tell you about one of them specifically, because I think a single real named life explains this far better than statistics ever could. In the spring of 2002, construction workers preparing a housing development in Amesbury, just a few miles from Stonehenge, uncovered a grave considerably richer than anything found from this period anywhere else in Britain. Inside lay a man somewhere between 35 and 45 years old at the time of his death, buried with an almost startling collection of belongings: 5 beaker pots, 18 arrowheads, a pair of stone wrist guards, 3 copper knives, a pair of gold hair ornaments, the earliest gold objects ever discovered anywhere in England. Archaeologists nicknamed him the Amesbury Archer, and for a while the media happily crowned him the King of Stonehenge. Here is where the story gets a little more interesting than the nickname suggests, though. Careful analysis of his skeleton found no evidence of the kind of muscle development you would expect from someone who had spent a lifetime drawing a bow, and his left kneecap was entirely missing, likely the result of an old disabling injury that would have left him with a pronounced limp for years. Whoever this man actually was, he was probably not much of a hunter at all. What he almost certainly was based on a distinctive stone found in his grave used as a metalworking anvil, was one of the very first people in Britain who actually knew how to work copper, arriving with knowledge that would have looked close to sorcery to anyone who had never seen metal shaped by fire before. And where did he come from? Careful chemical analysis of his teeth, which quietly record the water and food a person consumed during childhood, points to somewhere in Central Europe, most likely near the Alps. This man had walked or travelled an enormous distance from home, eventually settling and dying within sight of a monument that local farmers had only just finished raising. He was not buried entirely alone either. Close by, archaeologists found a second grave, a younger man researchers now simply call the companion, buried with his own more modest collection of belongings. For years nobody could say for certain how or whether the two were connected. It was only decades later, once genetic testing had advanced considerably further, that researchers finally confirmed a real if distant family relationship between them, something in the neighbourhood of a great-grandfather and great-grandson according to more recent analysis. Two related men, generations apart, both carrying step ancestry, both ending up buried within sight of the very same stones, an entire small family story quietly preserved underground for over 4,000 years. Can you picture that moment for a second? A limping foreign metalworker carrying knowledge nobody on this island possessed, yet arriving at the base of freshly raised stones that had taken a farming community 5 centuries to complete stones that must have looked to him like nothing he had ever encountered on his entire journey west. His story turns out to be far from unique. A landmark genetic study published in 2018, examining hundreds of ancient skeletons spanning the Neolithic period through the early Bronze Age, revealed something almost identical to what we discussed not long ago tonight, and honestly it still catches me off guard every time I think it through properly. Neolithic farmers buried in Britain before this period carry no meaningful trace of steppe ancestry whatsoever. None. And yet individuals buried after the Beaker complex arrives, every single one studied, carry substantial amounts of it. More than 90% of the male skeletons from this period onward carry a genetic marker on their male line that had never once appeared in Britain before a marker researchers can trace directly back to those same steppe populations. And this was not simply a story of armed men arriving alone. New genetic signatures traceable through the mother's line appear at the same time as well, meaning women migrated here in real substantial numbers too, not merely following behind a wave of conquest. Researchers now estimate that within a handful of centuries, somewhere around 90% of the genetic makeup of Britain's population had shifted again away from the farmers, whose monuments we spent so long admiring only a little while ago tonight. To be fair to the science, that 90% figure represents an estimate refined across several separate studies, and researchers continue debating the exact pace and mechanism involved, the same honest uncertainty we've run into more than once tonight already. But the broad outline, a rapid, thorough turnover rather than a slow blending, remains remarkably consistent across every major study conducted so far. Let that land properly for a moment, because I think it deserves to. This is now the second time in one single evening that we've watched almost an entire population's genetic legacy quietly disappear from this island. First, the hunter-gatherers swept aside by farmers arriving from the Mediterranean. Now the farmers themselves, the same people who spent 5 centuries raising Stonehenge, the same people who kept careful ancestor bones in long barrows, quietly and almost completely replaced in turn. The details differ considerably between the two events, worth noting honestly, rather than flattening into one single repeated story. The farmers arrived largely by boat along a slow coastal route traced across generations. These step-descended. Newcomers arrived overland, and by horse considerably faster, considerably more mobile, carrying metal the farmers had never possessed. But the underlying pattern, a population arriving from elsewhere and within a handful of centuries becoming the overwhelming majority, repeats itself here with an almost eerie familiarity. Here is the question I keep coming back to, and I suspect you might be arriving at it right about now too, if you have been paying close attention tonight. If the hunter-gatherers were erased by farmers, and the farmers were erased by these step-descended newcomers who precisely gets to claim the title of the real original people of Britain, I am not sure there is a clean answer. I am not sure there is supposed to be one. Every single group we have met tonight, without exception, was at some point the newcomer. Their faces changed once more as well, continuing a trend we first noticed with the Neolithic farmers. Genetic markers linked to lighter skin and lighter eye colour appear at meaningfully higher frequency in these beaker-associated skeletons than in the farming population. They were replacing, pushing the general appearance of the island's population further still from where our story began tonight, with a man whose skin was dark and whose eyes were pale as a winter sky. And they brought with them one more quiet biological gift, easy to overlook but worth knowing about because you have very likely benefited from it yourself. Almost every mammal on Earth, humans included, naturally stops producing the enzyme needed to properly digest milk once it is weaned as an infant. For most of human history, that was simply how adult bodies worked, and drinking milk as a grown adult would have meant real digestive discomfort. Alongside their cattle and their new metalworking skills, these step-descended populations carried or rapidly developed once settled into a dairy-dependent way of life, a genetic mutation allowing that enzyme to keep working well into adulthood. Researchers call this lactase persistence, and it appears to have spread rapidly through populations who suddenly had a very good reason to want it, namely a herd of cattle standing right outside their door producing more milk than young children alone could ever consume. If you have ever poured milk into your coffee this evening without a second thought, or built an entire diet around cheese, yogurt and butter without ever considering it strange, there is a real chance you can thank a population of steppe herders and their cattle for that particular small ordinary pleasure. I would love to know, honestly, if any of this changes how you think about the word native when it comes to a place like Britain. Down in the comments, if you feel like sharing, I am honestly curious where your own mind goes with that question. What these new arrivals could not have known standing beside that limping metalworker's grave admiring stones that were still relatively new to the landscape is that their own turn at calling this island permanently theirs would eventually come to an end as well, just considerably more slowly this time, worn down not by one dramatic wave of newcomers, but by centuries of smaller arrivals, each one leaving its own quiet mark on who exactly would eventually get to call themselves British. Soldiers would come next, then settlers speaking languages this metalworker would never have recognized, then raiders, arriving by longship from the north, then conquerors from across a narrow strip of water to the south. Britain, it turns out, was never quite finished changing hands, and the closer we get to the present day, the more those changes begin leaving behind names, dates, and written records, rather than only bones and pottery for us to interpret from a distance. Let's move through these next arrivals a little faster than we have been, not because they matter less, but because each one deserves its own honest place in a much longer, much busier chapter of this island's story, one increasingly lit by written records rather than only bone and pottery. The first of them came wearing armour most of Britain had never seen before, and they came quite deliberately in the name of an empire that already stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the hills of Syria. Rome's conquest of Britain, beginning properly in the middle of the 1st century, brought roads, walls, bathhouses, and an entire administrative machine this island had never experienced. For nearly 4 centuries, Britain sat as a working province at the edge of an empire that stretched from the misty hills of Scotland all the way to the deserts of Egypt, connected by roads so well engineered that some of them still guide modern traffic today. In the north, an entire wall was raised clear across the width of the island, marking the empire's furthest edge in this direction. A statement in stone that even Rome, for all its ambition, eventually decided some ground simply was not worth the trouble of holding. Yet here is the detail that tends to surprise people the most precisely, because everything else about Rome seems so permanent. Genetically, this occupation left a surprisingly light footprint. Soldiers, officials, and traders rotated through Britain from every corner of an enormous empire, and some of them stayed married locally and raised families. But Rome ruled this island primarily through administration, rather than large-scale settlement, and when the legions finally withdrew in the early 5th century, the underlying population beneath all those roads and walls remained overwhelmingly the same one that had been there before the eagles ever arrived. That does not mean Roman Britain was some quiet, homogeneous backwater, though. Quite the opposite. In York, a Roman city the empire knew as Eboracum, archaeologists studying skeletons from this period have found real tangible evidence of just how far people travelled to reach this island. One woman, buried sometime in the 4th century in a stone coffin, wearing ivory bracelets and fine jewellery, appears from the shape of her skull and the chemistry of her teeth to have grown up somewhere warm, quite possibly North Africa, before eventually living out her life in northern England, a considerable distance from home, in an age most of us assume moved at nothing faster than a walking pace. Researchers now simply call her the Ivory Bangle Lady, and studies of other skeletons from Roman York suggest she was far from alone, with roughly 1 in 10 individuals examined showing likely connections to regions well beyond Europe. Her grave goods alone tell their own quiet story of wealth and belonging, fine glassware jet, and ivory bracelets and a small inscribed bone panel, wishing her well in the afterlife, the kind of tender personal detail that makes a stranger from 1700 years ago feel suddenly considerably less strange. Rome, whatever else it did to this island, briefly made a small corner of northern England considerably more cosmopolitan than most of Britain would be again for well over 1,000 years afterward. Then Rome left rather suddenly by historical standards, withdrawing its legions to defend a crumbling empire elsewhere, and within a matter of generations an entirely different set of newcomers began arriving from across the North Sea. We know them today as the Anglo-Saxons, though that single tidy label hides considerably more complexity than it suggests. A major genetic study published in 2022, examining hundreds of skeletons from this period, found that roughly 75% of the ancestry present in eastern and southern England during these centuries traced directly back to communities living along the North Sea coastline of what is now the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. This was real, substantial migration, not simply a change in fashion or language borrowed second-hand. What makes this particular wave truly different from the 2 great replacements we spent so much of tonight discussing, though, is the evidence of actual integration. At a cemetery near Dover, researchers managed to reconstruct a family tree spanning 4 full generations, and were able to pinpoint the exact point where a local family and a migrant family became one and the same, sharing burial ground, sharing descendants, sharing a future. In Cambridgeshire, one woman was laid to rest alongside an entire cow, an extraordinarily generous offering for the time, and genetic testing shows she herself carried mostly local ancestry, buried with exactly the same care and status as anyone else in that community, regardless of which side of the North Sea her family happened to descend from. Elsewhere, the picture looks considerably less harmonious. At a site in Sussex, archaeologists found people of local and migrant ancestry buried in visibly different styles within the very same cemetery, suggesting a community that lived alongside each other without necessarily blending into one. Researchers also noticed something quietly telling about gender in these burials. Women with continental ancestry were considerably more likely to be buried with valuable brooches and beads than local women were, while men buried with weapons turned out to belong to both groups. In roughly equal measure, a small but real clue about how status, marriage, and identity were actually negotiated between these two populations, generation after generation. Britain, it turns out, did not experience one single Anglo-Saxon story. It experienced hundreds of small local ones, some warm, some considerably more guarded, playing out differently from village to village. Modern England still carries the mark of this particular wave, though somewhat diluted by everything that came afterward. Today's English population derives roughly 40% of its ancestry from these same continental newcomers, a substantial legacy, but no longer anywhere close to the overwhelming majority it represented at the time. Can I ask you something quickly before we move on? Does it surprise you that this particular wave, unlike the ones before, it actually left behind real evidence of two populations choosing, at least in some places, to build a life together rather than simply replacing one another? I find it strangely hopeful, tucked in among everything else we've covered tonight. A reminder that population change did not always have to mean one group quietly disappearing to make room for another. Next came the Vikings, and here the genetic story takes a turn I suspect very few of you are expecting. Longships first appeared off the coast of northern England in the closing years of the 8th century, striking the island's coastal monasteries with a violence that truly shocked contemporary chroniclers, before raiding eventually gave way to serious permanent settlement across large portions of eastern and northern Britain, an entire region so thoroughly reshaped by Norse rule that it earned its own lasting name, the Danelaw. Their influence on language, law, and place names across this region remains obvious even today. The very word law itself, along with sky window, and dozens of others woven so deeply into English that nobody thinks twice about them, comes directly from Old Norse. Entire towns across the north of England still carry Norse endings in their names, a quiet linguistic fingerprint left behind by people who never imagined anyone would still be reading it 1,000 years later. And yet, when researchers went looking for a clear, distinct genetic signature belonging specifically to these Danish settlers across most of England, they struggled to find one. The reason turns out to be almost embarrassingly simple once you hear it. Danish Vikings and the earlier Anglo-Saxon settlers we just discussed both originated from broadly the same corner of northern Europe, genetically similar enough that separating one wave from the other in a modern person's genetic code has proven remarkably difficult, even with the powerful tools available today. Culturally, the Danes left an unmistakable mark. Genetically, in most of England, they blend almost invisibly into a population that already looked a great deal like them. Travel far enough north, though, and the picture changes considerably. In Orkney, off the northern tip of Scotland, roughly a quarter of the population's ancestry traces directly back to Norway, specifically a clear, measurable, unmistakable Norse signature that stands out sharply against the rest of the British Isles, with neighbouring Shetland showing an even higher share. Crucially, this did not represent another clean replacement. Norse settlers arriving in Orkney intermarried extensively with the existing Pictish population already living there, blending rather than erasing, leaving behind an island population that is quite literally both at once. Finally, in 1066, an entirely different kind of conquest arrived from the south, a duke from Normandy crossing the Channel with an army defeating the English king at Hastings on a single brutal October afternoon and installing an entirely new ruling class across the country within a matter of years. Within a generation, nearly every English landholder of any real importance had been replaced by a Norman one, the old language of government pushed firmly aside by French and castles, an architectural style barely seen on this island, before began rising across the countryside as a blunt, unmistakable statement of who now held power. Even the very language you're listening to right now still carries the scar tissue of that particular year, thousands of French-derived words sitting alongside older Germanic ones, often describing the exact same thing twice, simply because two different ruling classes once needed two different words for it. Here, strangely, the genetic story echoes Rome far more closely than it echoes the Vikings or the Anglo-Saxons before them. The Norman conquest replaced Britain's aristocracy almost completely, castles' titles and land holdings changing hands with real, sometimes brutal speed. But it did not bring anywhere near the scale of ordinary population movement the earlier waves had. This was a change in who ruled far more than a change in who the ordinary population actually was. Modern genetic studies do detect a real signal connected to northern France, running through the English population today, present even as far north as Scotland and Orkney, but researchers remain honestly unsure whether that signal traces specifically back to William's conquest or to centuries of quieter, more ordinary movement back and forth across a remarkably narrow stretch of water, long before and long after 1066 ever happened. Once again, honest science leaves us with a real answer wrapped inside a real unresolved question. Step back for a moment and look at the whole shape of what we have just walked through. Farmers who nearly erased hunter-gatherers, steppe herders who nearly erased farmers, then considerably more gently wave after wave of Romans, Saxons, Vikings and Normans, each one leaving a different kind of mark, some deep and genetic, some mostly cultural and linguistic, layered one on top of another, like sediment settling at the bottom of a very old, very patient river. Some layers replaced almost everything beneath them, burying the previous one so thoroughly it nearly vanished from the record entirely. Others simply settled quietly on top, changing the language people spoke, or the laws they lived under, while leaving the blood underneath largely undisturbed, more like a fresh coat of paint than a rebuilt foundation. There is no single layer in that riverbed you could point to and call the real one. There never was, and honestly, the closer you look, the less that question even seems to matter. I would truly love to know, honestly, which one of these particular waves surprised you the most tonight. The ones that quietly vanished almost completely, or the ones that left behind a language, a legal system, and barely a genetic trace at all. Let me know, down in the comments whenever you get the chance, and while you're there, tell me honestly whether you expected the Vikings of all people to turn out to be genetically harder to trace than the quiet farmers who came thousands of years before them. What all of this leaves us with finally is a modern Britain built from every single layer we have walked through tonight, not one of them cancelling out the others, but all of them still quietly present somewhere in the blood of people walking around this island right now, most of whom have never once stopped to wonder just how many different beginnings it actually took to make them. And that, as it turns out, is not simply a poetic way of putting things. Scientists have actually gone looking for these layers, directly mapping the genetic makeup of thousands of ordinary people living across modern Britain today, and what they found still quietly traces the outline of kingdoms, borders, and migrations that most history books stopped mentioning centuries ago. To close out tonight properly, I want to show you exactly what that map looks like and what it might actually mean for the word we have been circling around this entire evening. Native. Native. It is such a small word for something this complicated, isn't it? We use it constantly, almost carelessly, as though it describes something fixed and permanent, a line drawn cleanly around a person or a place. Tonight, if nothing else, I hope it feels a little less simple than it did a few hours ago. To understand exactly how complicated researchers eventually did something wonderfully direct. Rather than simply studying ancient bones, a team of scientists set out to map the genetic makeup of people living across Britain right now today, in this exact moment. They deliberately sought out individuals whose grandparents on both sides had all been born within the same small corner of the country, a clever piece of detective work designed to capture a kind of genetic snapshot from before the 20th century, before cars, trains, and city life scattered families across the map and blurred centuries of local pattern into a single, indistinct blur. In total, they gathered detailed genetic information from thousands of people scattered across rural England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, patiently building what amounted to the most detailed, fine-grained genetic map of this island ever assembled. What they found once all that data was finally laid out honestly startled even the researchers involved. The genetic clusters that emerged from this study did not scatter randomly across Britain. They lined up with remarkable precision against boundaries that most people today have completely forgotten ever existed. In Wales, the data split cleanly along a line separating the north from the south, a division that maps almost perfectly onto two ancient kingdoms, Gwynedd and Dyfed, both of which stopped existing as independent political entities the better part of 1,000 years ago. Nobody drew this boundary onto the genetic data by hand. It simply emerged on its own out of the blood of people who had no idea they were carrying a border, their ancestors abandoned centuries before any of them were born. Orkney stood apart just as clearly carrying that unmistakable Norwegian signature we talked about not long ago tonight. Cornwall, tucked into the southwestern corner of England, showed its own distinct genetic identity, as well separate enough from its neighbours that researchers could pick it out from the data almost immediately, a faint echo, perhaps, of how long that particular peninsula spent existing somewhat apart from the rest of England, both politically and culturally. And stretching across the wide, low-lying heart of England, one enormous, remarkably uniform genetic cluster emerged covering a huge portion of the country, with barely any internal variation at all, a lasting testament to just how easily people had moved, married and mixed across that particular stretch of ground for well over 1,000 years, exactly the kind of flat-open, easily travelled landscape that tends to blur old boundaries rather than preserve them. Here is the detail I find most oddly delightful out of the entire study, and I think it deserves a proper moment before we move on. Researchers went looking specifically for a single unified genetic signature they could point to and call Celtic, the kind of tidy ancient tribal identity so often invoked today in songs, in flags, in arguments about heritage and belonging. They did not find one. What they found instead were several genetically distinct populations scattered across what modern culture likes to lump together as one single Celtic identity, each shaped by its own separate particular history, no more unified with each other than any other patchwork of neighbouring regions might be. Cornwall did not genetically match Wales. Wales did not genetically match the Scottish Highlands. The people of Northern Ireland carried their own distinct pattern, as well separate again from all the others. An idea many of us grew up treating as ancient, solid fact turns out to be something considerably closer to a much newer story, one built more from romantic imagination poetry and 19th century nostalgia than from anything actually written into human blood. I do not say that to take anything away from anyone's sense of heritage, honestly. Culture, language, and identity are entirely real and entirely worth celebrating, whether or not a laboratory can confirm every detail of the story we tell about them. I only think it is worth knowing honestly that the version of the past most of us carry around in our heads is often considerably tidier than the actual complicated blood underneath it. Can you feel where this is heading just a little? Because I think you can. Somewhere at the very start of tonight's story, in a quiet cave in the west of England, we met a man who lived roughly 10,000 years ago, carrying skin darker than almost anyone alive today would expect, and eyes paler than almost anyone would have guessed belonged alongside it. We watch scientists pull his face gently back out of a fragment of bone smaller than a coin, more than a century after workmen chasing better drainage first stumbled onto his bones entirely by accident. We met a schoolteacher living less than a mile from that same cave, who volunteered a simple cheek swab to demonstrate a painless procedure to his students, and woke up the next morning connected by an unbroken line of mothers to a man who had been dead for 300 generations. That teacher's story, if you remember, it was the very first time tonight we ran into this evening's central lesson, gently disguised as a heartwarming headline. Everyone who saw that story assumed the resemblance would run deeper than it actually did, that shared blood surely meant a shared face. It did not. And now, hours later, having walked through farmers, steppe herders, Romans, Saxons, Vikings, and Normans, I hope that same lesson lands with considerably more weight than it did back at the beginning of the night. If we could run that same modern genetic map across that entire chain of people, the hunter-gatherer, the farmers who replaced him, the steppe herders who replaced them, the Romans, the Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, layer after layer, we spent this whole night walking through together, what would we actually find sitting still in the blood of somebody standing in that exact same spot today? The honest answer is all of it in careful, uneven proportions. Even the hunter-gatherer lineage we open tonight's story with, the one replaced so thoroughly by farmers and replaced again by steppe herders, never fully vanished. A small persistent trace of it survives quietly, diluted but never entirely erased in the genetic code of people living across modern Britain today, the last faint fingerprint of a man who once stood beside a river with no name, having no possible way of knowing that some small stubborn piece of him would still be here 10,000 years later. There was never a single pure population waiting patiently underneath all those layers for us to dig down and finally uncover. There was only ever more layers folded into one another generation after generation, until separating them became almost beside the point. I want to say something plainly before we close tonight's story because I think it matters, and I have tried to be honest with you all night rather than simply comforting. The idea of a pure, unchanging national identity, untouched by outside influence, has never once existed, not in Britain, and honestly not anywhere else on this earth either. Every population we met tonight, without a single exception, was at some point in its own history the newcomer arriving somewhere that already belonged to somebody else, eventually becoming in turn the population some other arrival would one day replace or marry into, or slowly blend alongside. Identity, it turns out, was never a fixed photograph. It was always from the very beginning a river moving, mixing, carrying sediment from 100 different sources, never quite the same shape twice, and never actually finished. If that unsettles you slightly, I understand completely. It unsettled me too the first time I really sat with it, because most of us are raised to think of our own heritage as a straight unbroken line leading directly back to some solid ancient point of origin. Tonight hopefully made that picture feel a little less like a straight line and a little more like what it actually was, a long winding, occasionally messy river, joined again and again by new tributaries, none of which ever fully cancelled out what came before. But I have come to find something quietly comforting in it as well, and I hope by now some small part of you does too. If belonging has never once depended on staying perfectly still, on tracing an unbroken line back to some mythical, unchanging original people, then none of us are required to apologize for our own family's more recent arrivals, either wherever in the world that particular story happens to be unfolding tonight. Whether your own family has been in one place for 10 generations or arrived somewhere new just last year, you're doing exactly what every single person in tonight's story eventually did. Arriving, adapting, and slowly, quietly becoming part of the ground you stand on. If you are listening from somewhere in the United States tonight, you might remember that land bridge we talked about right near the very beginning of this journey, the one connecting Siberia to Alaska, carrying the first people into a continent that had never felt a human footstep before. Britain and America, it turns out, share more than a language and a rocky political history. They share the exact same underlying pattern, arrival after arrival, layer after layer, each one eventually becoming simply, quietly home. Change, migration, mixture, all of it is not a threat to identity. It is and has always been the actual raw material identity is built from. Let's go back just once more to where we began. Picture that same quiet stretch of England 10,000 years ago, ice finally retreating, rivers running fresh again after a silence longer than anyone could measure. A small group of people, tired, watchful, stepping onto ground with no name yet, carrying nothing but what they could hold, following herds they could not have known would eventually vanish into forests. They could not have known would eventually be cleared for fields beside a lake that would eventually give up a house, a paddle, a handful of deer skull headdresses, and a tiny scratched piece of shale patiently waiting 11,000 years for someone to finally come looking. They did not know any of what was coming. Not the farmers arriving by boat with grain and frightened livestock. Not the steppe herders arriving on horseback with bronze and a taste for milk. Not Rome with its roads and its walls and its brief cosmopolitan cities. Not the Saxons, the Vikings, or the Normans, each one slowly rewriting the language spoken over that same stretch of ground. Not the scientists who would one day drill a hole barely wider than a grain of rice into the base of a skull, and somehow impossibly pull a face back out of the dark only to discover it looked nothing like anyone expected. They only knew the cold morning air and the sound of a river they trusted, and the quiet, ordinary hope of surviving until nightfall. And somehow, improbably, through every single wave of change we have walked through together tonight, some quiet thread, connecting all of it. However thin, however many times it was rewoven by somebody new, made its way all the way to right now to you, wherever you happen to be listening from, wrapped in something warm, eyes finally growing heavy in a bed that sits on ground that has almost certainly at some point belonged to somebody else entirely. Let the room stay quiet for a moment. Let the weight of the day finally settle. Whatever waves eventually reshape the ground beneath your own life, you are here now, and that simply is the only part of the story that actually needs finishing tonight. Thank you for spending this particular night with me, and with all of them, the hunter-gatherer with his impossible combination of features, the farmers who quietly disappeared, the metal worker who limped his way here from the Alps, the schoolteacher who never expected to become the story himself. I know it was a long journey, considerably longer than most nights we spend together, and I am grateful you trusted me to walk it with you, all the way from that first quiet footstep to this exact quiet moment. If tonight's story kept you company the way I hoped it would, I would love nothing more than to do this again with you. Soon, somewhere else entirely in some other quiet corner of history neither of us has visited yet. There are so many more of these stories waiting patiently the same way this one waited for 10,000 years, and I already cannot wait to bring you along for the next one. Rest assured, another night, another story is already on its way toward you. Until then, sleep well, sleep deeply and rest easy, knowing that whoever you are and wherever your own story actually began, you're in every sense that has ever mattered exactly where you're supposed to be.